Today, Douglas Dietrich is on the program to talk about the 8 years he spent as a research librarian for the Department of Defense at El Presidio Real de San Francisco military base. There, along with his primary duty of document destruction, he was assigned to locate and access incredibly rare occult grimoires for whom Douglas claims is the official recognized satanic chaplain of the United States Army, Lieutenant Colonel Michael A. Aquino. Douglas will speak about occultism and Satanism within the U.S. military. He'll also share his evidence for child abuse, pornography, blackmail, and mind control in the military. This is quite a story, and as always, we'll leave it up to you to decide what to make of the material presented. Welcome to Red Eyes Radio, Douglas. Great to have you with us. Thank you for coming on. I know it's early in the morning over there, and you, just as I am an evening person, so I know sometimes it can be difficult to go up and, of course, talk about this very heavy research first thing in the morning. So really appreciate you coming on, Douglas. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here with the listening audience of Red Eyes Creations Radio, and I am honored and privileged to be speaking to Henrik because I've heard so much about the service that you provide for the alternative information community.
Thank you, Douglas. Great. Now, you have a very interesting background as a Department of Defense research librarian, and I've been following the rumors, I guess it is for me at this stage, that we've heard about for years now regarding the U.S. military and their use of occult warfare, involvement in Satanism, everything from Jack Parsons to the CIA's occult handbooks on magic, called the official CIA Manual of Trickery and Deception, to things like the First Earth Battalion, remote viewing, and the rumors of Colonel Michael Aquino. And, when going through some of your material, Douglas, I mean, if your story is accurate, this is verification and corroboration on many of these claims and stories, again, that we've only heard in passing about throughout the years. And quite a bit have been coming out, obviously, about the MK Ultra program and Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird. But I think this is going to be really interesting, so I'm looking forward very much to talking more about this with you today, Douglas.
Absolutely, and I'll be happy to do so. As a matter of fact, to put this into perspective for you, if Satan has a home, it's San Francisco, where I not so much live as I'm stranded here. San Francisco is one of the most expensive cities in the world in which to live. It is literally surpassed in terms of expenses at various times New York City or Tokyo or London in terms of its expense, and even Hawaii. So it's a very strange area. One of the reasons why it's so expensive is the lack of land. It's a very small peninsula, and it also has been compounded by the Silicon Valley boom of many years ago, where everyone just thought it was the most important thing in the world to be identified as having an office in San Francisco. And so the real estate went way up, and therefore it's a very strange kind of environment. And Colonel Aquino happens to be pretty much my neighbor. He's literally within walking distance, within a few blocks. I certainly did not know him growing up because I grew up in a very different part of the city. I grew up in the Tenderloin ghetto of San Francisco. And it's called Tenderloin because the policemen who cruised or patrolled the streets of the Tenderloin ghetto of San Francisco were paid hazard pay, and as a result they could afford to eat tenderloin steak every night. And that's how dangerous that area was. But I grew up a military dependent, meaning that my father was a U.S. serviceman. As a matter of fact, I was born essentially a naturalized American citizen, but I was not born in the United States. I was born in the Republic of China as reestablished on the island of Taiwan, which is not recognized by the United Nations. The Nationalist Republic of China was one of the founding member states of the United Nations, and therefore had a seat on the United Nations Security Council with the other major allies of the Second World War: France, Britain, the Soviet Union at the time, the United States, and the Nationalist Republic of China. Now Communist China has taken that seat, whereas the Nationalist Republic of China, as exiled to the island of Taiwan, is not recognized among the 195 United Nations recognized nations of the world. But I was born there, the son of a U.S. serviceman, and therefore was a naturalized American citizen. However, unlike John McCain, who was born on a military base, I was not born on official United States territory. Therefore, unlike him, I could never run for president, which I'm sure everyone is thankful for. But at any rate, in terms of Colonel Michael Aquino, and it's pronounced two ways, it's either Aquino or Aquino. He was essentially born on the day of the Nuremberg hangings in 1946 or 47, and I believe it was October 16th of 1946. And he basically met Anton Szandor LaVey, the founder of the First Church of Satan, in the Boy Scouts of the United States, which is another organization which has a fairly wholesome image, but at times it breaks out that there's enormous scandals, such as homosexual child predation within the Boy Scouts done by the Scoutmasters, and at other times less so, scandals will break out about the practice of Satanism within the Boy Scouts. But they were both outstanding scouts. Colonel Michael Aquino was the national commander of the Eagle Scouts, and Anton Szandor LaVey, the founder of the First Church of Satan, was a Eagle Scout. So at any rate, in 1968, Colonel Michael Aquino graduated from the Psychological Operations Department of the Special Warfare School, John F. Kennedy Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So he was a Special Forces officer, an officer of the Green Berets, as so glamorized by John Wayne. And in 1969, he officially converted, formally converted to the First Church of Satan, as organized by Anton Szandor LaVey. And this church had been established in 1966, the same year that I was born. And so after he had converted to that church, he was deployed to Vietnam. And in June of 1969, he started serving in with the 6th PSYOP Battalion, Psychological Operations Battalion, in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone of the Republic of South Vietnam, around the Saigon, General Saigon region. And that's where he made a name for himself in terms of the use of magic. Basically, one of the things that we had run into in the Vietnam War for the Americans was that they were experimenting with various types of psychological warfare. One of those types of psychological warfare was the use of helicopters over the forces of the Viet Cong, or elements of the North Vietnamese army that were advising them. And one of the unusual techniques that they used to try and disorient these troops, because they couldn't find them all or locate them all or shoot them all, so they would try to reach huge blankets of them with psychological effect through sound. So they would have these stereo speaker systems that were in the helicopters that would play loud demonic screams to try and disorient or frighten the troops that were coming near bases. And this didn't work well at all, because the Vietnamese had developed a rule of thumb, a literal rule of thumb, where if they held their thumb up in the air and the helicopter was bigger than their thumb, they knew they could take it out with a rocket-propelled grenade, because it was close enough to hit. And so they were taking down helicopters and their crews, and most importantly to the military of all, very expensive stereo equipment. And while they were knocking all of this down out of the sky and costing the U.S. Army just thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of damage, they approached Colonel Michael Aquino and said, well, you're a Satanist and a black magician. I should say that with a K, because they, within that community, they're very stressful about this. Magic spelled with a K, as you probably already know. Yeah. Shows that it's true magic that affects the reality of the universe around it, as opposed to prestidigitation or sleight of hand or stage legerdemain. It's not just parlor tricks. Actual occult forces are manipulated. So they said to him, can you get these screams out of the sky for us without us risking so much men and materials? And he said he could do it. And so he channeled the Diabolicon. And he did this by going into a trance state, and basically started in a trance state to write quatrains, or as people who are familiar with Nostradamus would understand this, poetic prose statements. And he basically channeled no less than 8 demonic entities: Satan, Beelzebub, Azazel, Abaddon, Asmodeus, Astaroth, Belial, and Leviathan. And he basically wrote a tome of occult work almost out of thin air, and was able, through this work, to call screams out of thin air. Now, I was ordered, as with so many materials, to destroy documentation of this, and not because it was in any way, shape, or form incriminating. In terms of Michael Aquino's case, he probably just didn't want records of it around, and had a tremendous sway over what stayed around and what didn't. Mm-hmm. But in general, I need to emphasize that so many of the documents I destroyed for the Department of Defense were destroyed not to hide information from the media or from academia out of any sense of conspiracy, but quite simply just to make room. The Department of Defense, after a while, didn't even care what it had. They had literally tons of documentation that they were just trying to get rid of to make space. And in those days, what was gotten rid of potentially was lost forever. And indeed, generally that was the case. And oftentimes, this was to their benefit. So this is the kind of mentality that we were contending with. But in the case of this, and we can go into that in some more detail in a few minutes, but in the case of Colonel Michael Aquino specifically, using the Diabolicon as a focus, he was able to call out demonic screams that were so powerful that the visual effect that I saw on footage of this was as if the sound was sourcing from everywhere. It was like a wall of sound. Viet Cong at that point in history were literally knocked off their feet. And this was so disorienting, so threatening to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese High Command, that they ultimately targeted the Diabolicon as a military target. And it was at one point almost totally destroyed by enemy fire. He had to rechannel it. And at that time, he was probably left with about 2 handwritten copies. Now, those were both in storage at the Presidio Military Base library where I worked. And to show you how seriously the atheistic communist enemy took this instrument of occultism, they were both heavily damaged by enemy fire, and one of them literally had bullet holes in it. So this is the level of seriousness with which it was taken. But the end result of this was that Colonel Michael Aquino, more importantly than his effect in the field against the Vietnamese who were fighting against the Americans, he proved to the American military that the occult was cost-effective. And because of that, he was officially recognized as the satanic chaplain of the United States Army. And the United States Army was the first military in the world to have an officially recognized United States officially recognized satanic chaplaincy. And as a matter of fact, in his retirement, many generals, many high-ranking officers are consulted for they're contracted for consultation in retirement. So they never truly retire because their security clearances are so high, they can't afford to retire them. And a good example of that would be that if you're in the military for many, many years, the top secret security clearance is the absolute rock bottom of security clearance levels. Mm-hmm. Pretty much everyone's given that just to work in restricted areas of bases. You start getting numeric and alphabetical classifications that bring you up into higher and higher levels of classification until you get to ranks of classification like crypto top secret, cosmic top secret, and in the case of the U.S. president, it used to be required that they have a military experience. It was an unspoken rule because they were commander-in-chief of all military forces. That's no longer the case, and as a result, most presidents have functionally no security clearance. So you're talking about a commander-in-chief of all the armed forces who has a security clearance, which is given to him basically as an honorarium as a president, mm-hmm. where he's got maybe like a top-secret security clearance, and he's got generals and even high-ranking officers who are at the colonel status or major type of status, and they basically have security clearances that are light years above that of their commander-in-chief, and that's the way they like it, because they can manipulate him. He's in a box. He has no idea what's going on.
That means, Douglas, that the president doesn't have any power. He isn't in the know, correct?
That is absolutely correct. And, to give you one example of this, the nuclear codes for many, many years were because the American Strategic Air Command that was in charge of the nuclear codes was so lazy, so corrupt, like all of the military is, like any other part of the U.S. government is. I mean, to put this into perspective for you, once you get a job for the government, the United States government, it's worse than in the Soviet Union in the sense that the Soviet Union was a monstrous amalgam of corrupt bureaucratic apparatchiks, party hacks, and incompetents who ran the Soviet Union to the ground. The U.S. military, being part of the U.S. government, and the U.S. government itself are no different. Once you get a job with the U.S. government, you can never be fired, ever. No matter what you do, you can never be fired. I would see this every day while I was working for the government. And I've worked for the government in the United States at the federal level, at the state level, and I've worked with it at the municipal level. And at every level, once you get a job with any of those governmental levels, but particularly federal, you can never be fired. I mean, you can literally not show up to work for weeks. Just show up with it after being missing for about 14, 15 days, just clock in, and nobody will care. You can go to work, you can go to sleep, and nobody cares. You can go to work pig-faced drunk, and nobody cares. I mean, they spend all day partying, and that's all they do. And these people who have a fantasy that there's all these security cameras all around the U.S. government facilities is living in a dream world. It's just projected by movies so that people get the delusion that the U.S. government works. The reality is no one's doing anything. And that's why, like the Soviet Union, the United States is in the middle of collapse. And to give you a good example of that was the nuclear codes. Basically, around the 1960s, they just decided that they never wanted to work to remember or change or continually revamp the nuclear codes. So for decades, they were all just 8 zeros. It was just 0, 0, 0, 0, all 8 in a row. And that was all it was. And the man who ran the Department of Defense, McNamara, had no idea of this. And he had no idea anyone had authorized that, and he didn't find out about it until 2004. This was years after he retired. If you remember McNamara, he was in charge of the DOD back during the age of the Vietnam War. Yeah. And so he was finally told in 2004, hey, did you know the nuclear codes were all just 8 zeros? And he had no idea of that. And that is essentially what the U.S. government is like. I mean, it's so bad that, and this has literally happened. It happens fairly frequently. You could go totally postal, violent, start killing all of your fellow workers. They'll send in a SWAT team or a tactical team of police to take you down. They'll kill you, but you'll die employed. You'll never be fired. That's how bad it is. I mean, that's literally what we're talking about. And so to give you an example again of how this is, San Francisco, I bring it up because it's so incestuous. And this has to peripherally connect with Colonel Aquino. One of the biggest problems that we ran into in the U.S. military was child molestation. You're dealing with a very cult-like environment. I was in the Marine Corps for a very short period of time, less than 2 years. I was dishonorably discharged from the United States Marine Corps. And the point is that one of the first things you notice, particularly in the Marine Corps, which, believe it or not, in its own way, in a general sense, is cleaner than the rest of the armed forces, or a little less corrupt in certain senses. But at any rate, it is still a branch of service that has its own form of corruption. But the point is that once you're in it, you realize that you've entered a cult without the redemption of a faith. They break you down, they rebuild you up in their image, and there is no, however, faith or some kind of cosmology that gives you any sense of meaning or purpose within that cult. Mm-hmm. The cult simply exists for the sake of perpetuating the cult. Well, with the sense of that emptiness in the Marine Corps, that's almost a blessing. With the Army, that cult that developed was Satanism. And to put it into perspective for you, the amount of people in the United States military, and this is very hard to believe for most people in the rest of the world because America runs the world's first global empire. Basically, out of the 195 recognized nation states that are recognized by the United Nations, America has troops in or occupies the majority of them. So there's not a single nation in the world that hardly has that doesn't have Americans who are not just in the embassies, but actually acting in a military advisory status. So with that much of a presence the world over, people would think the American military must be huge. But if you take all of the armed services, all of the reserves, all of the National Guard, and the entire Department of Defense, which is civilian, which is about 100,000 people, and you put them all together, they're less than 1% of the American population. America's population is the third largest in the world. First comes China and India, pretty much neck and neck, with 1 billion people each. And then comes the United States with 300 people that are legally recognized and 50 million illegal immigrants. So we've got 350 million people here. Mm-hmm. And when you take the amount of people that are in the military, which plus Department of Defense, which is about 2.5 million people, that's less than 1% of the American population.
Yeah.
And that's how small it is. And in that smaller community, you develop a very isolated, very occult perspective because they become wary of outsiders. They have a top-secret oriented mentation, and they hide everything from outsiders. And this is how they get over 51% of the annual discretionary fiscal income. Over 50%, literally on any given year, about 51% of our discretionary income in the United States goes to the military.
That's right. Yeah, we've published an article about this on the website, and I pointed it out many times during the program. It's just incredible when you think about it. So about 1% then receives above that 50% of the annual income there. That's just incredible. Now, was there a switch happened here somewhere along the line, Douglas, that where the Army, the Marine Corps, and all this began to turn over into Satanism, or has it been there since day one, or have someone organized this and make this shift happen? Because we've published articles on the website that detail, for instance, that there have been passages from the Bible on the weaponry and on the ammunition and things like this, kind of weird things that you wonder what the hell is going on here, and then you think, is this a Christian cult of sorts then? I mean, they're coming with their passages. There's a lot of churches, I've heard anyway, set up within the military, and some people are very, very religious, and they think that they're sent to Iraq by, God to sort things out and all this. That's the rumors we hear on the surface anyway, but obviously what you're sharing is the underpinnings of this, the underworld of this. But tell us about if there was a switch, as far as you know, happened here somewhere along the line, Douglas.
Well, in a sense there was, but in a sense there wasn't. The reality is this kind of dichotomy has existed for quite some time. The original founding fathers of the United States, the men who created the constitutional republic known as the United States, basically were deistic. They were Freemasons, and the Masonic lodges at that time had a lot more power than they do today. And at that time, the men who were in Masonic lodges weren't just middle-class men who were seeking companionship. This was actually a time when these were propertied men, these were slave owners, these were extremely wealthy men, and the perspective was based on Newtonian mechanics of our universe. They felt that ours was a clockwork universe. Deism was essentially the perspective or the cosmology of a God gone away, that God had created a clockwork mechanism of the universe and then abandoned it, which left it up to enlightened men, illuminated men like themselves to lead. That's how the founding fathers thought. So you have this already deistic perspective, which is very strange because the original people to colonize the United States, North America, hundreds of years before the constitutional republic existed, known as the United States, were Puritans, and they were religious fanatics who were so crazed and fundamentalist and ecstatic in their religious experiences that Cromwell, who killed his own king, he committed regicide to establish a theocracy over the British Isles. Even he couldn't stand them. So he sent them across the Atlantic, and that's where you get that fundamentalist puritanical streak in the American military. That may be what is being catered to by the biblical passages on the guns, but it also is probably, from what I understand, to be an inversion ceremonial act. In other words, taking the act from the passage of the Bible and actually desecrating it by placing it on a weapon is a very satanic thing to do, depending on who does it.
Exactly. Well, that's a very good point, Douglas. I just want to clarify this because I brought up the article now. It's actually 3G Con that are making the scopes, basically, that you look through to aim. And it says here, at the end of the serial number on 3G Con's ACOG gun site, you can read JN8, chapter 12, or colon 12, a reference to the New Testament book of John, chapter 8, verse 12, which reads, Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. And I have some images of that on the site when they've zoomed in on the scope there, basically on the site, and it's pretty interesting stuff. What the hell is this?
No, it's fascinating in its own sense. I mean, having grown up being exposed to this, to me it's quite, how would I say it? It's nothing is surprising at all.
Right,
I mean,
right.
To put this into perspective for you so you understand the true horror of it, and in a sense, we've gotten onto nuances. When we talk about the Founding Fathers, everybody zones out. That's like a sleeper, really, because the Americans make superheroes out of these individuals. And at the same time, the Americans really don't know that much about them. And so going from beyond them, basically, when the military took over the United States was only 100 years later after the establishment of the American Republic. It was in 1876. And what had happened was the American Civil War had just ended. The American Civil War was a railroad war. Every major battle in the American Civil War took place within 20 miles of track.
Mm-hmm.
And the end result was that the rail barons began to run what was essentially became the American military-industrial complex. And there was a man who won the presidency of the United States known as Samuel Tilden. And Samuel Tilden had won the United States by the popular vote, by millions of votes. And he had also won the presidency by the electoral vote, which is, if people understand the nuances of American domestic politics, America is a frontier nation and therefore had very sparsely populated frontier states. And in order to give them electoral representation, they were given what was known as an electoral vote. So even though they had far fewer people, to prevent them from seceding from the Union because they weren't getting proper representation while being taxed, they were given this electoral vote so that they would have a greater sway. Well, what happened was when Samuel Tilden won both of those votes, a lot of violence and bribery went into effect from the robber barons. This was all admitted to later on by the people in charge of the vote counting who took those bribes when they weren't given appointed positions that they had been promised, but by then it was too late. They managed to steal enough electoral votes to win the presidency for General Rutherford B. Hayes. And General Rutherford B. Hayes was a front man, a president-select, as opposed to a president-elect, for the rail barons. And he won by one single electoral vote, not the popular vote, but one single electoral vote after they stole the swing votes of Florida and Louisiana. Mm-hmm. And since that point in history, every president has been a president-select of the military-industrial complex. He was the first, and his first action was, of course, to order expansion westward to kill all of the Indians so that they could establish a rail system that ran all the way from the East Coast to the Pacific. And because of that, the United States Frontier Army wound up engaging for the next 30 years in no less than one Indian battle/massacre every single week of the year. That's the type of records that I was dealing with. And the end result was a genocide of literally about 100,000 American Indians all the way to the Pacific. And that was just the beginning of the military-industrial complex, and after that, it could not stop. It was on a rail, so to speak, where they had to have constant warfare in order to keep the expansion of the complex going. But that brings us back to the question, exactly how is it that less than 1%, you used the term 1%, it's far less than 1%. As a matter of fact, if you add in the 350 million people, then you divide it by that 2.5 million, you get something like you get a 0 point and then several zeros, sometimes up to 7 zeros before that 1. So you get far less than 1% of the population gets well over, or gets at least a little over half of all of the income in the United States every year. Now, the way they do this is because they have the politicians totally corrupted and totally blackmailed. They don't count on bribery because that would waste a lot of the money that they get. They count on basically getting the politicians involved with pedophilia. And when they get the politicians involved with pedophilia, the politicians that win are those that they have corrupted with pedophilia in the first place. That is where all the mind control programs come in, like MKUltra, like Artichoke. This is where you get severely damaged people who come out of the woodwork, who has said that they have been part of all of these mind control programs, and their stories are so outrageous. Nobody believes them, and that's how the U.S. military continually gets away with it. This super victimization, these super victims fall into what is generically given the nomenclature or the nickname of super soldier program, so that people are totally confused. They think bigger and badder. They think of hulking, steroid type of football players. Not the case at all. It's the most frail and victimized of orphans. I will put this into perspective for you. At the Presidio military base, where I worked as a Department of Defense research librarian for almost a decade, I was there for about 6, 7 years. Then I went to the Marine Corps for less than 2 years. Came back and worked for about 1.5 years, and left in 1992 when they closed the library down. Mm-hmm. In other words, I was there literally until the Presidio Military Base Library closed down. Then they closed the entire base in 1995 because the scandals of child molestation were so enormous, amongst other scandals. Now, what had happened was my high school teacher, by the way, this is all in on record and is accessible for anyone to research, though it is fairly difficult to find because all of this happened before DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, truly formally released the Internet. So in those days we had DARPANet and we had DeltaNet, which was part of the U.S. Army. And DeltaNet was notorious, I can get into that in a few moments, was notorious for carrying child molestation. And that was supposed to be the U.S. Army's specific electronic information dissemination network. Mm-hmm. And but in terms of why all of the child predation goes into part of that whole program for creating a cult-like environment of people who are totally unemployable and fit to do nothing else other than either go to jail or work in the military. And that's a big problem with the military. Where do we get the Satanism? With a lot of the military is a lot like a prison system. Now, America's prison population, I'm sure most Europeans are familiar with this, America's prison population is all out of proportion to its baseline population. It has, in proportion to its population, the largest prison population in the world. And it has its own Gulag archipelago. And the reason why is that it's a very diverse culture in terms of its economics. It's both a first world nation for the wealthy and a third world nation for the poor. Now, many people, rather than going to prison, go into the military. And so the same type of environment develops. In a prison, you have people who are members of ethnic gangs to protect themselves. Right. Part of the white Aryan supremacists, the black nationalists who are usually Muslim, or the Latin American Cholo, or La Raza, the revanchists, and they all fight each other on ethnic level. The U.S. military, during the time that I was in there, was exactly like that. You're just in a prison in uniform. That's why they wouldn't allow us to train with real ammunition. If you ever see U.S. soldiers training, they spend millions of dollars training with laser harnesses. And they train with laser harnesses so they can play laser tag because they know that if they give them real ammunition, they'll start killing each other. And what do you see in a prison riot? In a prison riot, they never kill the warden and they never kill the guards. They kill each other. They need the warden and they need the guards as hostages. But they go after each other because of their ethnic and gang rivalries. That's what happens in the military. I was in Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm, there was about 20 Marines that were killed at the Battle of Al-Qafia, where the Iraqis managed to fight back and strike back with a spoiler attack. There was about 9 soldiers that were killed behind the lines in a barracks. One of them was a woman that were killed by a stray Scud missile. Other than that, every single person that died on site in theater in Operation Desert Storm, which was about 350 people, close to about 400 or 500 people at the most, every single one of them was killed by another American. Every single one of them was killed by another American. Once they gave us the guns, all the Americans started to do was kill each other. The only thing that made Operation Desert Storm work was all the bombardment from the planes and the ships. If it weren't for that, nothing would have gotten done.
So it's out of control, and you're saying there no one trying to clean this up or get this in order properly, or maybe they just can't. It's out of control.
Oh, it's totally out of control. There's no way it could have gotten better. I can't imagine it could have gotten better. Nobody's lining up to join the military. These are men who would otherwise be homeless or in prison in general. You get certain exceptions to the rule. Patrick Tillman was an example. He was this wholesome, clean-cut golden boy who was a football player who gave up a multi-million-dollar contract after 9/11 so he could fight. He went into the U.S. Army Rangers. He didn't know what he was getting into. He was surrounded by a bunch of, in general, I would have to say this, I dealt with U.S. Army Rangers on the Presidio military base who were hardcore, multiple prison sentence child molesters. And to give you an example of this, do you remember the movie Black Hawk Down?
Actually, I've never seen the whole movie. I've phased out for some reason, but tell us about the story here, Douglas.
Yeah, well, the hero of Black Hawk Down, they gave him the name Danny Grimes in the film. It's based on a true story. That character, Danny Grimes, is based on a real man. He was a U.S. Army Ranger named John Stebbins, and his nickname was Stebby. Now, Stebby Stebbins was a convicted child molester. He spent the rest of his life at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison for basically raping children under 12, keeping them chained in his basement, and feeding them dog food out of dog bowls. And this guy was turned in by his own wife. And the point is that this is the kind of man that Patrick Tillman had behind his back. He wound up getting fragged behind his back because of men like this that he was working with. This is the kind of people who are in the special forces. You can imagine what the plain ones are like on the in the regular services. And also in the Marine Corps, which I was a part of, one of the reasons why the United Nations can't get child soldiers outlawed, they tried to make an international law to outlaw child soldiers. Well, in the United States, you're a child until you're age 18. Well, the United States Marine Corps accepts people who are 16 or 17 years old. So if child soldiers were to be outlawed, the Marine Corps would be left without anybody because the overwhelming majority of people who join the Marine Corps are only 16 or 17 years old because they're the only people naive enough to join. So the end result is the Marine Corps would be left without a good deal of its manpower were child soldiers to be outlawed by the United Nations. So the Marine Corps of the United States lobbies constantly that the United Nations be unable to outlaw child soldiers. So when I was in there, shortly after Desert Storm, when I got out, there was an enormous scandal in the United States Marine Corps about homosexual pornography being made at the San Diego Marine Corps Recruit Depot. That's where I had trained. There's only two places to train Marines, Parris Island in the East Coast and San Diego, where they call us Hollywood Marines. Well, they were making a bunch of porno movies in the Hollywood Marine Corps Recruit Training Depot, and then they covered it all up. It went out there for a short while. People heard it on television. The Marine Corps went into action, covered it all up, bought up as many of the porno tapes as they could, and destroyed them. But in terms of this is the kind of environment that we're talking about. Well, what happens in prisons? Aside from all the homosexual sex and homosexual rape, you get Satanism. People in prison try to psychologically dominate each other. That's why they have the satanic tattoos, the 666 and a clover leaf. That's why they pursue Santeria, various forms of voodoo, and then they do whatever they can to psychologically and occult-wise dominate each other. That's where the Satanism comes in. It's a prison environment. And in that prison environment, you get the same thing that you always get in prisons, homosexual child predation. And they use that by which to control politicians, and it's those politicians that they manipulate that make it to the top because those politicians are the most blackmailed, the most funded, and those politicians wind up consistently lobbying to give the military more and more money. Yeah. And here's a good example of it. The Child Daycare Center at the Presidio Military Base. Now, at the Child Daycare Center at the Presidio Military Base, and I emphasize this for anyone who has this fantasy that there's cameras in U.S. government buildings that are watching every move you make. Any cameras in a U.S. government building are pointed outside towards you. They're not pointed inside because what a government building is like Las Vegas. What happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. What happens in a government building stays in a government building. No one polices the police. Who polices the police? Nobody. Yeah. And in terms of these government buildings, Child Daycare Center, 1980s, when I worked at the Presidio Military Base, The U.S. Army alone took care, in terms of their daycare centers all over the world, in Panama, in West Germany, in the Philippines. Subic Bay was still open. In Okinawa, in South Korea. They had military bases all over the world, families working all over the world, and they all needed daycare centers. The U.S. Army in the 1980s took care, through its daycare centers, of 100,000 children a day.
Oh, wow.
100,000 children a day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Presidio Child Daycare Center was one of the largest. The Presidio military base is 1,500 acres. It's about 1,500 acres. It takes up a good deal of the city of San Francisco. And they had a child daycare center that could take care of 1,000 children. That's a lot of kids. And all of those kids started coming home with chlamydia, with gonorrhea, with syphilis, and basically any kind of venereal disease or sexually transmitted disease you can imagine. Worst of all, they were coming home with AIDS. Well, my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit, and he lived in a church because he was essentially homeless. Well, he was my teacher at high school. I majored in graphic illustration, commercial art at John O'Connell Vocational Institute, the vocational equivalent of a high school in San Francisco. He ran the Presidio Daycare Center. He was ultimately convicted. He was federally indicted by a federal grand jury for assaulting no less than 14 children sexually, all of them under 4 years old. And he would have been indicted for assaulting hundreds of children if he himself hadn't died of AIDS before they could get around to it. And he is calculated with probably having infected 1,000 children with AIDS. Not because he had sex with every single one in the daycare center, but because he had sex with many of them over many years. See, these families get transferred. They get rotated. So that one daycare center that can hold 1,000 people basically winds up getting circulated. So you've got thousands and thousands going there over a period of years. Some families only stay there for a few months. And during that period of time, he was raping many of them. Now, I got him arrested because he kept his child pornography at the school. He was homeless. He couldn't keep it at the church. He kept it at the school because it was a commercial art class. So he said all these pictures of naked children were art references. Now, he couldn't be arrested on the U.S. military base. They said, oh, they protected him. And they said, oh, he's our best employee. They protected him. Finally, I got him arrested by having pointing out the fact that the pornography was in the San Francisco Unified School District property. In other words, the San Francisco Police Department could finally arrest him. They had to wait until, in other words, see, the military police wouldn't arrest him, and when he was on federal property, the FBI wouldn't arrest him. None of these federal agencies would touch him. Suddenly, the guy gets out of that federal area. I'm able to get him arrested in a municipal area for keeping his child pornography in a San Francisco Unified School District area, so the San Francisco Police Department could arrest him. See, the feds wouldn't arrest him. Here's another example. That ranger I told you about, the so-called hero of Black Hawk Down, Stebby Stebbins. He's in Fort Leavenworth Military Prison. Why is that important? Because everybody says, hey, this ranger was raping all these kids when he was retired. And, it was after he was out of the service. And I'm saying, look, if he was out of the service, if he was even a mercenary on contract with the U.S. government for plausible deniability, like Blackwater, he wouldn't be in a military prison. He'd be in a civilian prison along with all the other baby raping SOBs.
Right.
He's in a military prison means he's under military control. That meant he was raping all those children under orders. There's no other way he would be in a military prison. He had to be under military control. They wouldn't take him otherwise.
Oh, that's absolutely great. Have you, by the way, as we talk about this, have you heard anything from Kay Griggs, the tapes she's released online, Douglas?
I have not, and to be quite honest with you, the name doesn't even ring a bell.
Wow.
Keep in mind that there are many victims of this sort of phenomena. If you explain her situation to me in a general sense, I might be able to address it, but probably not. The fact is that I'll give you an example. Lorianne Fenton, my executrix, who was kind enough to arrange with your staff this interview, she arranged the world's first super soldier summit in which she tried to put together a lot of these victims of mind control, MK Ultra, Project Artichoke, various super soldiers who were pimped out by the military as children or trained to be assassins, and there's a whole reason for that. To put this into perspective for you, these children are inducted into the military system without ever being on the military payroll. They're taken from foster homes. They're taken from orphanages. The U.S. Army Ranger, who I was personally had to work with for many years, it all started off with Loglan. You can look up the Loglan, Loglan. Logical language is what it's an acronym for. And it was developed by a doctor known as Encyclopedia Brown. And his last name was Dr. Brown. And you can look up his name by looking up the board game that was produced, I believe it was by Parker Brothers, called Careers. Do you remember a board game known as Careers?
Have not played that, actually, no.
It was around for many, many years. It was a very popular game. It might have been Milton Bradley. He designed that board game. And Dr. Brown, whose first name is escaping me at the moment, but it's easy enough. If you look up Loglan and you look up the game Careers and you look up which Dr. Brown that is, that's the same Dr. Brown. He was employed by the U.S. military to design a synthetic language that would incorporate the 8 most spoken languages of the world at that time. And this way, they were trying to get rid of all of the baggage of all of those languages and keep only what was in common between those languages so that they could have a perfect military language that was very streamlined to use amongst international allies. They were trying to find one that was had far less nuances to it than any of the other languages, a very Spartan language. And so this one ranger I was forced to work with was sent to his home to help him develop this language by learning it from him and then field testing it by using a radio to other rangers or special forces in the field of operations from the professor's home. Well, the professor came home one day to find this ranger raping his kids. And so the U.S. military shut the whole project down because the professor wouldn't cooperate anymore. Professor Brown wound up building and designing his own catamaran, sailing all around the world trying to use Loglan as a language of peace to try and undo what damage he had done by service to the U.S. military. He wound up dying, I believe, in an Argentine port hospital. He basically started dying at sea. They brought him into an Argentine port hospital where he died. I think that was around the year 2000. So that's the kind of sad story and tragedy that we're dealing with. Well, I was working on that Loglan thing with him and this U.S. Army Ranger back in the 1980s, the mid-80s, and he was doing this out of the University of San Diego, near the Marine Corps Recruit Training Depot, where I went to train in the Marine Corps. And when I looked up, I called the linguistics department later at the University of San Diego and asked them about information on Dr. Brown. I was trying to catch up when I started exposing myself and talking about this sort of subject. I was investigating this, and you know what? The University of San Diego claimed he was never there. They claimed he was never there, and yet you can look it up and you can find out that he was there. So this is the kind of backtracking that we're talking about. But in terms of when Lorien Fenton was organizing the Super Soldier Summit, one of the first things she did was she prevented me from talking with any of them or meeting any of them until the summit itself, because I had been working with the chief predator, Colonel Aquino, for almost a decade. They knew me. They knew my name. They'd heard of me because many of them had met Aquino. Aquino had international security clearances. He was on second mint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He was a member of the World Affairs Council. He had security clearances that allowed him to assess security issues in the United Kingdom. So many of the super soldier victims who had been under his auspice, where he had monitored these programs or administered them, were British. And there is this tremendous phenomena within that type of programming where they have them switch from an American accent to a British accent during their various altered personalities. And as you might know, for the general public who might be there, if this is their first exposure to this sort of thing, which anyone who listens to Red Ice Creations Radio would surprise me, I would suppose many people would be already familiar with this.
I believe so as well.
What happens in these programs is they traumatize these children. They adopt them, as I said, from these various environments where they have no family to fall back on or who will investigate their disappearance. And they basically break them down by having them adopt animals from pet stores, bring these kittens or puppies home, usually alternate between kittens and puppies to represent males and females. All dogs are boys, all cats are girls. They have them in this programming. And then they have them raise these animals, nurture them, and then under pain of torture, they make them kill them.
Yeah.
And that's the first break in the personality, the first split in the psyche. Then they have them do that with other childhood friends. Learn to take a affinity for them and then kill them. They develop a love, bond, kill programming. And these kind of bond kill assassins ultimately are split into so many personalities. The advantage for the U.S. military is that if they're arrested by the local constabulary or police department, no matter what interrogation they go through, they can't remember what they did because it was a different personality that did it. They can have up to 20 different personalities, sometimes more, sometimes less. And if they're arrested by foreign or even domestic inter-service rivalry that goes on, a different department, Navy versus Army, Air Force versus Marine, something like that, they get arrested by or somehow captured by one of those different rival military services. Nothing can be found out unless someone knows the key to break open or unlock the one persona or personality that committed the crime. Or foreign intelligence agencies can't break them either unless you know the code phrases to get the right memory. These personalities aren't even on the same timeline. These personalities are often in different timelines. And some of them are at different maturity levels. One will be a child, whereas other will be a semi-adult. Mm-hmm. Now, they pair them up with politicians, and basically the politicians will become compromised. And then not only has the politician become compromised, but by the time the politician is intimate with this individual, the individual has scoped out their estate, their apartment, their condominium, wherever they're living, in the countryside or in the city, enough through their intimate encounters to finish this politician off if the politician suddenly goes rogue, suddenly has a change of heart, suddenly develops a conscience. They can kill him because that's what they've been trained to do. And by that time, they're familiar with his environment. Then what happens? Then the military can approach the family and say, well, your father or your husband has just been killed by a queer whore, is the term that they use. That was the term they often used in the military. Just been killed by a queer whore, and we've got all this photographic evidence of it, and if you report this or you don't do as we say, you don't grow up to become a politician to take his place and lobby for all this money we need, then we're going to turn this loose about your family, and your family will never be able to do any politics again. And so that's how the U.S. military, less than 1% of the population, continues to get over 50% of the income. Now, to put this in perspective for you, like I said, those children at the daycare center were basically coming in with all sorts of diseases. Now, my high school teacher, Gary Hambright, even a scumbag like him couldn't have AIDS combined with chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and everything else you can imagine and still remain ambulatory. There had to be several other people involved. And again, where were all the cameras? Just to emphasize this to the public who has this fantasy from Mission Impossible that we've got cameras watching us every minute. Mm-hmm. There's no cameras inside of these daycare centers, and what could be more valuable than the future of your children? and there's no cameras there. They don't want people to see them while they're raping all these kids. And this was going on for years. Full government protection. As a matter of fact, the records for the child daycare center at the Presidio military base were kept at the community center. And the community center burned down in a fire in the 1980s that took away all evidence, burned all the evidence of what happened to these children. And the families were so enraged, they all got together and they burned the daycare center to the ground. And all of this happened within a very short period of time. Now, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, the same people who were responsible for killing everybody at Waco, were sent to investigate the fire at the community center, and they concluded it was arson. And the United States military claimed jurisdiction and said, well, you're a federal agency, we're a federal agency, and you're on our base, and we say it's not arson. And it was as simple as that. And to give you an example of this, there were millions of veterans injured in all of America's wars, from the Spanish-American War through the fall of Saigon in 1975. All of those records were taken and they were put into the National Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri. And the local municipal fire department in 1975 protested because the U.S. government refused to install fire alarms or sprinkler systems. But because it was federal property, there was nothing the fire department could do about it. Now, the department that ran that facility was the General Services Administration. They run the Federal Archives. They had a regional office right here in San Bruno, California. Now, in the course of my primary career as a civilian military librarian, I was able to review the in-house Federal Archives Agency training reel before I was ordered to destroy it, and expose the fact that there were no less than 15 starting points of inception which instigated a fire which took down that facility. And what they did by destroying all these documents of millions of veterans was they saved the government billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, in veterans benefits. They didn't have to pay anybody.
Okay.
And just as an aside, Lee Harvey Oswald's records were in there. James Earl Ray's records were in there. My father's records were in there. Everybody's records were in there. Any VA bureaucrat will tell you that they will deal with the repercussions of that arson until the last Vietnam vet drops dying. So if they're willing to do that, you can imagine what they're doing to anything. And I spent a career destroying documents in an incinerator. So all of America's history is destroyed. This is why, like the Soviet Union, it has no future. One of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed was because they kept destroying all evidence of everything they did, and they kept fabricating new records. A more clumsy example of this would be the Encyclopedia Sovietica, where they had an entry on Beria of the KGB, and when he was taken out of power and fell out of favor, they took him out of that encyclopedia. This was in the days before computer. All they had was print.
Right.
And because they had a set number of pages in the Encyclopedia Sovietica, they had to expand their definition of the Bering Strait, which had come before Beria, to an extra 10 pages. See, this was how they used to redeploy their history, and they wound up collapsing because of it, because in the end they had no history. The United States is going through that same matrix of unreality. They don't live in the real world. And because of that, they lose every war they fight, because they're naive enough to believe they won the wars they were told they won. They honestly believe that. If you ever listen to General Petraeus, who now runs the CIA, he wrote a dissertation at his military academy, which earned him a promotion, and he basically, in that dissertation, talked about how the United States won the Vietnam War. This is the kind of insanity that we're talking about. And these are the kind of men that I was dealing with all of my life. And so when I'm in these facilities, one of the first things I noticed was, because all these men spend time overseas, one of the first things they do is many of them take advantage of child prostitution. And I grew up thinking that there was something wrong with me because I had no taste for children. And everyone around me did. It was only when I was probably around 25 years old, we're talking about a quarter of a century old, when I was out of the Marine Corps, or excuse me, that was before the Marine Corps, when I was considering entering the Marine Corps at that time, and then decided against it at that time. Then I went in later anyway because I needed experience. When I realized I could no longer work for the U.S. government, I wanted to make big money, and I realized I could do so as a mercenary. I knew I needed the training. I had to get it, and the only really good place to get it was a place like the Marine Corps. And but during that period of time, till I was going through these various decisions, I thought there was something wrong with me, and it was only later around that time I realized it wasn't me. It was them. It was everyone around me that was essentially warped, perverted, twisted. And that is the kind of environment that we're talking about. And this is the environment in which this kind of Satanism thrives, because and by the way, the correct term for it is not Satanism, because Colonel Aquino separated from the Church of Satan. First Church of Satan under Anton Szandor LaVey was a kind of hedonistic humanism. And also, Anton Szandor LaVey was very much an atheist. He was very antithetical to churches taking advantage of the tax-exempt status in the United States. So he proudly paid taxes. Every member of the Church of Satan pays taxes, and that's a big deal with them. But Colonel Michael Aquino wanted a full church recognition so he could have a tax-exempt status. And that's ultimately why he organized, one of the many reasons he organized the Temple of Set. So when he organized the Temple of Set, it was recognized as a Luciferan church. So Luciferanism is different from the Satanism.
Okay.
And it's tax exempt, officially recognized as a church. Now, when he was retired, as I said, many men are consulted in their retirement. He was contracted to write the chaplain's handbook for the United States Army. And people can look this up. I've actually posted it on my Facebook more than a few times. And people can go to my Facebook and scroll down if they do Facebook and find that chaplain's handbook. But it's out there on the internet anyway. But bear in mind the absurdity or the meaning of this. The United States Army didn't approach a rabbi. They didn't approach a priest. They didn't approach some religious representative from some Protestant church. Instead, they approached a Satanist and had a Satanist write the chaplain's handbook for the United States Army, with long sections on magic with a K, and of course Satanism, and how to respect Satanists, and how it was basically so the rest of the churches, Jewish or Christian or Catholic or otherwise, would make sure that they didn't interfere or disrespect the Satanists among them. That is basically what the U.S. Army Chaplain's Manual is all about. And so this is the insanity of which we speak. You have, in essence, a satanic military that runs that occupies a good deal of the world. If there has ever been, as so many Christian fundamentalists fear, a one world empire of the Antichrist, it is this.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Douglas. We're going to carry on and talk more about this in the next segment. We're going to round things up here in a little bit. This is very interesting. You have so much material to share, Douglas, of course. And but before we take a little break, though, let's talk a little bit about your website and where people can go to find out more about your work, your past, your research that you've done on the DoD. You, of course, do talks. And I believe as well, Douglas, that you have a couple of upcoming books in the works. So why don't you share with us that and where people can go to find out more about this?
Yes, thank you so much for asking that. Please go to www.douglasdietrich.com, and I'm going to spell that out for you. Douglas is spelled with one S. And Dietrich, just think of the German-American actress Marlene Dietrich. And if you're too young to remember her, just put the words diet and rich together. And so DouglasDietRich.com, Dietrich would be how Dietrich is spelled with a CH at the end. So DouglasDietrich.com, and we're discontinuing our DVD package. As soon as all of these currently remaining DVD sets are gone, they'll never be reissued again. The one DVD, Roswell and the Rising Sun, which led directly to my mother's death when I formally and personally came out, not anonymously like I had back in 1995, came out about the subject of the Roswell files. Basically, I came home after we delivered that presentation to find my mother dying in very suspicious circumstances. That's a whole different story in and of itself. But we're going to try and analog that into printed text format. And it definitely was already the subject of what I spoke about at UFOCon 2012, our UFOCon, here in Santa Clara, in the greater San Francisco Bay Area just recently, just a few days ago. And the other DVD, Satan's Crusaders, was something that it was a presentation that I delivered, which is the content of that DVD, complete with photographs I took of human sacrifices that were conducted on site the Presidio military base. They are in there. And I managed to do that because I majored in the same criminology course at San Francisco City College that the founder of the Church of Satan, Anton Szandor LaVey, majored in. Anton Szandor LaVey entered college to avoid the Korean War era draft in the United States. He majored in criminology. I was taught criminal photography by the same instructors who instructed him. And he ultimately became a criminal photographer for the San Francisco Police Department and a person who was advising them on occult crimes. I definitely want to go into that, so bring that up, please, when we come back from the break. It's so important because it was his photographic techniques that I used to get photographs that otherwise would never be available to the public of these human sacrifices, the remains of them, not while they were ongoing. I wasn't present for the sacrifices themselves. Obviously, I would have done something.
Yeah.
But in terms of the aftermath. But in terms of the contents of that DVD, I did various presentations on it, and will be doing so again at the Super Soldier Summit #2, which will be probably held in Las Vegas and probably around March of the year 2013. So towards this end, we're just offering both of these DVDs for the price of one until depletion of supply, so access them through DouglasDietrich.com. Also, in terms of the secret history of the Second World War, please consult Nexus Magazine, and Nexus Magazine conducted an 8-hour Skype interview with myself through Thomas Kirshner, the editor of Nexus Magazine for United Germany, and we were able to get that into transcript form into 8-page segments. So I'm going to be in there for at least 4 issues. So since it's a bi-monthly periodical, we're talking 8 months out of the year at least I will be in Nexus Magazine. 2 of those issues have already come out. One of them is going into print and circulation within hours. And so literally all you need to do is go to nexusmagazine.com. Once again, that's www.nexusmagazine.com. Nexus is spelled N-E-X-U-S. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. You can even download the articles of mine alone for $1.50 each. I don't make any money out of this whatsoever. I'm just trying to inform the rest of the world of what's going on with the American Empire and what happens within the American Empire. And so I'm doing this with Nexus Magazine just so that I can be internationally recognized for what it is that I'm trying to expose. Keep in mind, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Henrik, that Nexus Magazine is not allowed to circulate in the United States. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I thought they had an American branch there, didn't they?
They did, and it was shut down.
When was it shut down?
It was shut down years ago. It had to be at least 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay, I did not know that. All right.
Yeah, it's not allowed to circulate in the United States. Duncan Rhodes, the editor out of Australia, of course, Nexus Magazine is well read within Europe and the Commonwealth of British nations.
Sure.
And English-speaking publications are all sourcing out of Australia, where Duncan Rhodes, the editor, lives. And he's doing his best to try and get reestablished in the United States, but he's had major challenges. The United States does not. This is not a free country. I want to make this known to everybody, and people have to get used to this idea because we've grown up in a very ideologically tainted world. The 20th century was a century of ideological warfare, just as the centuries before it were centuries of religious warfare. We are returning very quickly to a new dark age of religious warfare. But in the interim, the so-called modern age, we're entering a postmodern age of religious warfare, but the modern age was a age of ideological warfare. And democracy is functionally has turned out to be a totalitarian ideology, just as repressive as any of the other totalitarian ideologies it was competing with, such as communism and fascism. And that's how it operates in the United States. The United States can be, for a person like myself, a dangerous place to live. I lost my mother as a result of coming out with what I did, and I've lost other loved ones as well. I mean, the only reason I can speak as freely as I do, and I'll tell you this, Henrik, straight out, is every single one of the relatives that I know or love is dead. Mm-hmm. And that's something you have to keep in mind about any so-called whistleblower. If you look at these people, and if they're married, and they have a family, they can't be for real. It's that simple.
Okay.
I mean, anyone you're interviewing, whether it's, for instance, at the UFO con, I came under attack by Richard Dolan. Now, there goes an individual who has a family, he's got kids, he's not saying anything real. And the DVD of that confrontation will be sold by the man who organized, along with my executrix, UFOCon, Brian William Hall. He's co-producers with my executrix, Laurie and Fenton. The both of them made an agreement with everybody who attended that the speakers panel would be recorded. and the speakers panel was recorded, so this will be available for thousands of people to see anyway. So I might as well tell my side of the story before it gets tainted by the government, which Dolan works for. Basically, they had two shills in the audience, and they stood up on camera, of course, and one of them said, while we're all there on the speakers panel, they asked a question, "Mr. Dolan, what do you think of Mr. Dietrich's work?" He instantly began a personal attack on me, introduced it the way they always do. "Oh, don't take this personally, Douglas. This is nothing personal. I like you personally." That means he's going to attack you personally. At any rate, started this whole regurgitation of the government propaganda about World War II and all this historical fiction. He just started regurgitating this pablum, and I responded to him, and I informed him, "Look, you walked out of my lecture, you walked out of my presentation, you don't even know what I said. You admitted at the banquet where you sat on the same table with me the night before, you had never checked into any of my work or any of my research." And he had nothing to say other than, "Oh, well, I had another interview to conduct. I had to walk out," and then he wound up, just barking like a dog. He just, at the end of it, was just saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa." You could see it on camera. I said, "Yeah, wow." And that was that. Then the next guy, later on, you'll see on camera, stands up and says, "Mr. Dolan, do you think that they could have sent some young, charismatic, highly educated, intelligent, articulate individual to mislead us all?" And based on the shill before him, obviously, and who he's questioning, he's alluding to myself. But thankfully, Sean David Morton, the man who was acting as master of ceremonies for that panel, said, "Yeah, that would be me," and just shot that question down. But this is kind of what we deal with, and the entire way that the government speaks to each other, their signals to each other. Having worked with the government for many years in police work, I graduated from the San Francisco Police Academy. I still have the graduation certificate. Never served as a peace officer for very long because I went deaf in my right ear. But with this kind of thing going down, one of the first things you notice when you're working with police work, private security enforcement, which was my second career, mercenary work, which was part of that second career of private contracting, one of the first things you notice is that if you see men show up anywhere in the United States or anywhere where you see American activity, and it looks like you can shoot them and bury them in the same suit, they're federal, they're government. Most other people in the United States can't afford a suit. I mean, this sounds strange, but if you're working in business these days in the United States, very few people wear suits. If you notice that in America, there's less and less people in suits. Very few people can afford the tailoring. Very few people can afford the clothing. That's how bad it is in America economically. People really don't get it in the rest of the world how bad it is here, especially in Eastern Europe. They think the streets are paved with gold here. They watch these old movies from the 50s. The reality is most Americans live in their cars. Most Americans can barely eke out enough to feed themselves, let alone their families. When somebody shows up in a suit, he's government. And there's Richard Dolan showing up everywhere in a suit. This is what we're talking about, this kind of activity. And the UFO community is the most infiltrated of all of these subcultures. And you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, most people who are interested in the UFO phenomena don't vote. Most of them are nearly homeless. The majority of them are just interested in the subject with an obsession. And they're more neurotic and unemployable than anything else as a rule. Many of them are experiencers, and they're rendered unemployable and neurotic by their experience. So you have to ask yourself, why is, I was at the conference, and there was a father of 4 children. He had his 4 children with him. He was walking in front of me, and I was entering the meeting room, and I heard him talking to his children right in front of me. "Hey, there goes the UFO people. Put on your tinfoil hats." Ah, and all the kids are all laughing. I felt like asking him to attend my lecture, and maybe he would change his mind, but there's no point in embarrassing a father in front of his children. But this goes to show you what the American public thinks of people who investigate UFOs. They're that impotent in terms of a community. Everybody dismisses them. So why are they so heavily infiltrated by the government? And people who have investigated this, such as the man who was the author of the book Mirror Men, have indisputably proven the U.S. government invests an enormous amount in infiltrating the UFO community. I'll tell you why. Because of me. What they were afraid of was that ultimately someone like myself, the perfect storm in terms of information exposure, would come about through that community, because that's the only community that I could come out through. Because eventually the perfect storm wrapped in a human body, someone who had all the motivations and nothing to lose, who used to work for the government would really come out of that community and expose what was going on.
Well, I have not heard anything about the UFO work that you've talked about, Douglas, before, so maybe we can go into that a little bit more in the second hour as we begin to approach our break here in a little bit. Once again here, then, I want to give out the website, and we're going to carry on talking about this and much more, of course. DouglasDietrich.com. We're going to have that linked up on RedIceCreations.com as well, so you can click through easily to find out more about Douglas and some of the things he has available for you. But all right, we have much more to talk about. Thanks for the first hour, Douglas. Stay with us. We're going to continue in just a few minutes. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second segment. We're talking with Douglas Dietrich about his time as a research librarian at the DOD, and we left off with some pretty big claims from Douglas. We're going to continue hearing more about this, of course. I want to ask you how much of this you actually can talk about, or if you did not sign a disclosure agreement, are you in violation of everything you're talking about currently? Are there certain things that are off limits? I think this would be pretty interesting to listen to.
I really appreciate your asking that. It's important to emphasize the fact that I always caveat normally whenever I'm doing any interviews, especially when we get into the areas of talking about history and forbidden history or hidden history or occulted history. The obvious question is, what about security clearances? You were a Department of Defense research librarian. Initially, I started as a librarian's aide, graduated to the level of military reference technician, but because my educational level within a very short period of time was a full-fledged Department of Defense research librarian. Now, during that entire period of time, I held the absolute rock bottom of security clearances. I never got beyond top secret. It was nothing to brag about. As I said, that's the same kind of security clearance that would be given to anybody who's working on open military base, and pretty much is given access to a few other areas that normal civilians aren't given access to. It's meaningless. The only reason that I got exposed to so much of what I was exposed to is because of that enormous corruption, stupidity, laziness, and incompetence of the U.S. government, of which I have spoken. The only thing that keeps the United States government functioning is its sheer wealth, the wealth and resources of the nation itself, the wealth and resources of the rest of the world, which it essentially occupies. And as a result, they can afford to literally get away with murder, literally get away with anything. And by murder, I'm saying that metaphorically too, where people are not doing any work. Well, how does that happen? Well, a lot of it happens by basically putting all of the responsibilities on the person below you. Well, the lower down the ranks you are, the more work you do or are forced to do. So the end result is that I was naive enough to think I wanted a career with the DOD, to think that it would actually get me someplace. It took me almost a decade to realize they were never going to give me anything. And the end result was that I didn't need a security clearance to be exposed to all this, because the men who had them, such as my operations manager at the Presidio Military Base Library, weren't doing any work and just passed it all on to me. And basically, they would say, handle this. I'd say, well, that has a security level that I'm not supposed to access. And, well, I don't care. Handle it. You know, you just do it. I'm not going to do it. You do it. You want the job, right? It went on. And basically, it got to the point where, in the case of the Roswell files, which we might save for another show, it's per your discretion. We might touch on that today. The problem is that, like any real history, it would be like describing all of World War II. How would you do that unless, you know, at least you get an entire show to outline that? But the Roswell files, to give you a perspective on how they were about this sort of security clearance issue, was basically Roswell incident took place, of course, in 1947 before there was an Air Force. There was no U.S. Air Force at the time. There was the U.S. Army Air Corps. So even though the documents and files were kept at the what is known today as Area 51, or what used to be affiliated with Travis Army Airfield, that entire region within Nevada, they basically were still under Army auspice, because it occurred during a time when it was under Army responsibility at the Roswell Army Airfield, etc. And Strategic Air Command at that time was still part of the U.S. Army under the Air Corps. So the commandant of the Presidio military base wanted access to the Roswell files. This was part of an ongoing project that had to do with Colonel Michael Aquino. Colonel Michael Aquino, when he was in Vietnam, and at that time, of course, he wasn't a colonel, and indeed, all the time I worked with him, he was only a lieutenant colonel. He later retired a colonel. But at any rate, when he was in Vietnam and he was still a relatively low-ranking officer, it was 1969, Sergeant Melvin Brown began to talk. Sergeant Melvin Brown turned around to his family when men landed on the moon and said, I worked with enemy aliens, and I looked under the tarp. They told me not to look at the bodies at Roswell, but I looked at them, and they were yellow, burnt orange, and they turned gray with rigor mortis. And his family just took that automatically to be extraterrestrials. And then the U.S. Army called Colonel Aquino back, and they said, hey, we want you to work with this. We originally said it was a disk, and everybody got this space feel about it. We took a Gallup poll, found out that 90% of the population, city of Gallup, which takes the Gallup poll, by the way, is in New Mexico. It is in the same state as Roswell. And so they said we found out 90% of the American population believes in flying saucers. That's the highest ratings they've ever had before or since for anything. And they said, we want you to work with this and see if you can really make it stick. And so he started this whole psyops where he chronically needed to access Roswell materials. So finally, the commandant of the Presidio military base ordered the Roswell files to be delivered to the Presidio military base. So I get walked into the room where they were sent to by my operations manager, and he said, hey, Douglas, look at these. And I looked at them, and they were all these big locker boxes, and they all had on them Crypto Cosmic Top Secret. I thought it was a joke. And stapled to each one of those labels was another word, above. Above Crypto Cosmic Top Secret. I said, sir, I don't have any security clearances that would ever give me permission to look at these materials. I could spend the rest of my life in jail just for seeing these. And he said, Dietrich, you get to work on those materials, collating those documents for the commandant of this base right now, or I'm going to tell the military police you tried to walk out with some of those materials in those boxes under your armpit, and you will spend the rest of your life in jail. And I said, oh, sir, I don't think. Yeah, that's right, Dietrich, you don't think. You work for the government. That's how it always was. That just epitomizes it. Another example, you got Colonel Aquino himself. He, because of his international security clearances, could access, say, for instance, military libraries, not only here, but in South Africa, in Canada, in anywhere within the British Commonwealth of Nations, such as Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom itself. And he used to order grimoires, or occult tomes, from various militarily financed universities. And all universities in the U.S. that are reputable get military finance. And many universities in other countries are the same way, because they access their student body for research. In other words, their professors will do research for them, scientists, etc. So what they did was he would contact universities, various libraries that were federally affiliated, and of course other military libraries, and from these, even museums, because museums would often get a lot of government grants or funding. He would say, I need this occult tome, this grimoire, the old word for grammar, the old occult ritual magic books. Some of them were put together before there was a Gutenberg printing press. They were literally priceless. Some of them were bound in human skin. Some of them were written in human blood. And you couldn't even open them because they kept them in refrigerated safes in these museums. They wouldn't even let professors open them because that would compromise the integrity of the book itself. It would disintegrate or crumble. And basically, he would access these from these libraries saying, this is international security. This is an international security issue. And that's how he would get access. They would deliver it to the library like it was fine china with a courier. And because he ordered them through the OCLC, the Online Cataloging and Library Cooperation Program, that's what existed in those days, because he would use that system, they had to stay in the library. So because of that, Colonel Aquino conducted all of his major rituals whenever he had to use these grimoires for such in the library. They could not leave the library grounds. So he followed the rules to that extent. So he would have many officers come in to conduct rituals on site, the Presidio military base library, and we're talking about 9 to 13 men at a time that would come in to these covens and gatherings. I never saw a single one that was underneath the rank of major.
Now, did you see this with your own eyes, or does this come from documentation that now then consequently has been destroyed, or are there any paper trail for any of this?
Oh, absolutely. Well, like I said, on my DVD, Satan's Crusader is part of that DVD set that we're selling through the website. And believe me, there's very few of those left. We got pretty much cleared out the inventory with the UFOCon. So I'm telling you the truth when I say that there's less than half 100 left, if that. So please get them while you can. Yes, I got the photo because we'll try and put them into a book later or do something with it. But we have to get them out of that DVD format because it's just not good to keep it in a format like that. But the point is that I have photographs of the various elements of this, such as the results of sacrifice. To put this into perspective for you, the Presidio military base was site of Letterman Army Medical Center. Letterman Army Medical Center was where they trained the vast majority of Army doctors. 25% at least of all Army doctors at any one time were trained or graduated from the Letterman Army Medical Center. Now, Letterman Army Medical Center had an unholy alliance and arrangement with the California prison system. To give you an idea of how large the penitentiary system is in the United States, the California prison system's prison guards are the highest paid law enforcement officers in the world. Think about what I'm saying. The highest paid law enforcement officers in the world are California prison guards. That's how powerful a union they have. These are people who live, they literally buy yachts. I'm not kidding. And so this prison system, through the governor of the state of California, made an arrangement with the U.S. Army that prisoners could be given revocation of death sentences, gubernatorial pardons, shortening of prison sentences, prison privileges, or even release if they volunteered for experimentation with the United States Army. So they would have various prisoners who would go in for experiments. Some of them were quite funny. There was this one where they fed these people nothing but salmon burgers, salmon tofu, salmon everything for months. Now, how did I know about this? Because I was a DOD librarian who had to liaison and cooperate with the medical librarians at the Letterman Army Medical Center. So I would say, oh, these are personnel records. They don't belong here. Had to take them over to the Letterman Army Medical Center library. So the medical library also had to bring things to me, which were like division records, etc. Oh, this goes here. So I was constantly working in liaison with the librarians at the Letterman Army Medical Center medical library. And at times I had to spell them or relieve them. I often worked at the medical library. So I often met these people. Many times they were brought to the main library because the medical library was so specialized. So they'd bring them to the main library because they had to give them something to read. So these prisoners would be living on base in the hospital for months. They'd have nothing to eat but salmon, per this one example I'm giving you. And they'd come, and whether they were black, African American, or Caucasian, white, European American, they would come in and their skin would be orange. And I said, what the hell happened to you? Oh, it's the salmon. They feed us nothing but salmon. And I'd have to hide all the candy bars. I'd have to hide the sandwiches, anything, because they'd try and grab it. And they always had MP escorts, so they wouldn't try to escape. They were escorted by military police, give them reading materials, then they'd go back to the prisons, their holding cells in Letterman Army Medical Center. That was just moderately funny. But there were other cases, such as the ones I took photographs of that are in my DVD, where these prisoners disappeared. Their records disappeared. Later on, their head would be found somewhere on the base. That's the level of sinister talk that we're talking about. The sinister occurrences that we're talking about, excuse me. Mm-hmm. And there would it just goes on. I mean, I speak about the medical experimentation at the military base. I met one of those prisoners even before I worked as a librarian, to give you an example, where I was a patient because I was a military dependent. My father was a veteran of over 30 years of service in 3 wars. He was in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And with over 30 years of service in the U.S. Navy, I had full access as military dependent to taking advantage of medical treatment at the Letterman Army Medical Center. So all the while I grew up in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, whenever I was sick, which was often because of the filthy environment that the Tenderloin presented, I was at the Letterman Army Medical Center. One time I had bleeding duodenal ulcers. This was just before I became a librarian's aide, and I was about just over 15 years old. And while I was in there for a few weeks, while they gave me a full blood transfusion, and I had to let it take, and there were infections, etc., basically what had happened was there was a woman who was being kept in the hospital who apparently was undergoing one of these experiments. She'd been a prisoner who made a deal to get herself released if she underwent some experimentation. Now, her head was totally shaven. She used to come in to visit me, and she had a microchip. That's what I would recognize it as today. Back in those days, I didn't even know what it was. Implanted right at the base of her skull, right on top of her spine, at the tip of her spine, right where the spinal column and the base of the skull connect. Very bizarre. So I never even found out her name. That, again, that was before I worked as a librarian. But that's the kind of situation we're talking about at Letterman Army Medical Center. So in terms of security clearances, I hope that puts it into perspective for you, where we've got a situation where I didn't, it wasn't that I had one. And so everything I saw was I was working with under protest. I was never supposed to see it. It was all based on government corruption and stupidity. And whoever thinks, because I get this all the time, people say, oh, they misdirected you with this misinformation. They're feeding you all this misinformation. It's crazy, because I never spoke of it. Keep in mind, I left the Presidio military base in 1992, was the last year I worked there. Mm-hmm. They closed the entire base down in 1995, and that's when I anonymously came out with some of the Roswell materials. That led into enormous repercussions that most people are unfamiliar with, and then I didn't speak about it again until literally around the year 2008. So we're talking about around 2008. So if they chose someone to spread misinformation, they chose the wrong man, because I never spoke about it for decades, and the chances of my getting hit by a truck or getting killed with all the contract work I was doing were extremely high. So the idea that I would survive to be a disinformation agent is absurd. All the odds were against me. If they took a risk on me, they banked on the wrong guy. Well, now all their nightmares have come home. And as a result, my ability to talk is what really threatens them. And people ask, well, how do you stay alive? Because all the while I was liaising with Colonel Aquino, I essentially was someone he wanted as his heir apparent. He was outspoken about that. He took me to the 1st Earth Battalion Satanic Monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico at one point. And he had often brought up the fact that I would make a well-rounded black magician and a good member of his church. And as I said, he's still essentially neighbors with me. He lives on Leavenworth Street here in San Francisco. I live on Green Street. We're only a few blocks apart. I could walk to his home anytime. We've been neighbors forever. And I don't speak to him anymore. I haven't spoken to him since I stopped working at the library at the Presidio military base back in 1992. And but the reality is, that's why Laurie and Fenton wouldn't let me talk to the super soldiers until we met at the summit itself, because they looked on me as someone to loathe and to fear. I had worked with the whole super soldier phenomena from the Predator's perspective. And
I've heard Aquino, by the way, throughout the years now as well. He's vehemently denied all of this, and he seems to be very disheartened about all of these claims made against him. I'm seeing him sitting on TV. I've seen, if that's even him, of course, but not on TV, but online, actually, apparently in email conversations with people. And so he's not willing to talk about that if any of this is true,
Oh, well, I'll put it into perspective for you. He was certainly adamantly trying to pursue lawsuits against the many people who were speaking about him and talking about what happened with these various programs. And as a matter of fact, one of the first internet content providers to ever exist, back when DARPA first released the internet, was a company known as Electricity. It was spelled E-L-E-C-T-R-I-C-I-T-I. And Electricity was sued by Colonel Aquino for defamation of character because they released information about these acquisitions against him. This went all the way up to the Superior Court of San Francisco, case 984751, and he lost. Now, I know all this because I was his personal liaison, and as his personal liaison, I had to handle his correspondence. And I'm the individual who basically got him off from serving serious jail time because I basically was able to prove physically he was never at the Presidio military base when all the child molestation went down. If you remember, I said there had to be many more besides Gary Hambright, my high school teacher, because of the number of diseases involved. Now, another lawsuit he lost was against the U.S. Army. He sued the CID, the Criminal Investigations Division of the U.S. Army, to get his name off record from the allegations of child molestation at the Presidio Daycare Center. And he lost. So he's lost several lawsuits saying that he wasn't there, which is one reason why he is disheartened and doesn't pursue it too much further. And I can understand that. Now, this is the crux. All of the children who were at the Presidio Daycare Center described him to a T, physically. They described Gary Hambright, who they knew as Mikey. They described Colonel Aquino. They described his wife. Now, there's two ways to explain this. Either by location. Some people who are really into new technologies will claim holography. Another explanation potentially might be the tunnel system under the Presidio military base. Presidio military base was originally established by the conquistadors under the Pax Hispaniensis of the Spanish Empire. And it was over 200 years ago. The oldest building in San Francisco is the Presidio Officers Club, which is right across the street from the main postal library. And that was established in 1776. That means that the Presidio has buildings that are as old as the overwhelming majority of buildings on the east coast of the United States, over 200 years old. And the conquistadors enslaved the local tribe, the Ohlone tribe, O-H-L-O-N-E, Ohlone First Peoples Nation, the American Indians there, forced them to dig for gold. They dug enormous tunnels underneath the Presidio military base. Later on, when the United States, conquered from Mexico the captaincy of the Presidio, they took El Presidio and they expanded those tunnels and reinforced them so that they could carry enormous cannon, because the Presidio was the gateway to the Golden Gate of the San Francisco Bay Area. And at that time, until World War I, the population of San Francisco was 20 times that of Los Angeles. That was the only real American gateway to the Orient. So to guard this precious gateway, they set up all these underground cannons that could come out of the ground where the ships couldn't reach them and then bombard any incoming ships. So all these underground artillery bunkers were basically concretized, reinforced, and in the 1950s, after the Second World War was officially over with Japan, April 27th, 1952, when the Treaty of San Francisco went into effect. People can look this up. At any rate, at that time, they began to concretize and lead line the tunnels in order to reinforce them against nuclear attack, and they kept Nike Zeus anti-ballistic missiles in them to guard the city against nuclear bombardment. Now, those tunnels still exist today. When the Child Daycare Center scandal went down, all the children said they were taken into tunnels from one building to another and to torture chambers and tormented by robed figures bearing torches until they would remove their cowls and they would recognize these individuals and describe them. Now, the state of California, whatever you do, don't ever move to the state of California if you have children, because the state of California will not accept the eyewitness evidence of children. So all of the testimony was thrown out of court.
Okay.
And it's a perfect crime. So it's a perfect crime. You can do anything you want to kids, and their testimony does not count against you. End of story. That's how it works in California. Conceivably, Colonel Aquino was entering through the tunnel system without checking in with the military police at the gates, because when the Child Daycare Center scandal went down, my operations manager approached me directly, and he stood over my shoulder and made certain that I completed the task, ordered me to incinerate all of the maps of the Presidio tunnel systems. So I personally destroyed, with him watching over my shoulder, every single map. There is no map of the Presidio tunnel systems left.
Okay, well, that is interesting. How much of this now then have been destroyed, Douglas, overall, of all the different things we've been talking about here so far? Is much of the evidence for this now gone and buried, and it's basically only in your head, or is it still out there anywhere?
people can look up what they can. They'll certainly find out everything I say about Gary Willard Hambright is true. They'll certainly find out everything I say about the Child Daycare Center is true. And all of this, of course, remember that this was a court case for years. So there was much testimony brought into the court, even though it was ultimately, say, the children's testimony was all thrown out. That's why they couldn't do anything. Also, it was federal. Back in those days, you couldn't sue the U.S. government. The tragedy is it was in the days before the Internet. So they were able to hide it by transferring all those victimized families to the four corners of the earth. They transferred them to Panama, Okinawa, the Philippines, West Germany, everywhere, South Korea. And before they were all transferred, that's when they all got together and burned the daycare center to the ground. So, you know, people can look up the arsons concerning the Presidio, and they'll find out it's all true. I mean, it's all on record, but it was well hidden in the sense that because there was no Internet functionally at the time, certainly not to the extent that we have today, the Army got away with it. And it wasn't the only place it was happening. At West Point, which is famous for graduating Army officers, the Child Daycare Center building number was 666. And children were being raped and killed there. There was a sergeant who killed a girl who was like 20 months old, and he was set free with a dishonorable discharge. That's all he got. He didn't get any jail time. This is the kind of Army that we're talking about. So in terms of everything, you know, the man who investigated all the children that were being raped and molested there and said nothing was going on was Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was put in charge of investigating the West Point incident. And I don't know why or what the connection was, but I remember his name essentially being connected with it. People can look that up. They can confirm it. Everything that I'm bringing up, feel free to confirm it and look it up yourself. And that kind of brings us to the 1st Earth Battalion. It's actually... Yeah,
I wanted to get into that a little bit more. Tell us about that. And you didn't have any involvement with them, did you?
I did, only in the sense that, remember, under orders, I was given liaison duties to Colonel Michael Aquino, and this was after the breakup of the military with Dr. Brown in terms of his work with the logical language after that U.S. Army Ranger was caught molesting his kids. I don't know what their family says about that, or this is what I was getting from the U.S. military. And since I knew the Ranger who admitted to the crime, that's where I'm getting that testimony from. His name was Lionel Allen Curtis, for what that's worth. U.S. Army Ranger sniper, Master Sergeant Lionel Allen Curtis, a convicted child molester, it needs to be emphasized. Who was cop into that story, and I certainly was working with Logland, and people can look up that and find out originally it was at University of San Diego, etc., that it was being researched, and they probably won't find any connections with the Department of Defense research funding, but how else do these projects get funded? It's almost always military. Almost every physicist you know, from Michio Kaku through Sir Charles Schultz, all of them at one point or another worked with weapons development. That's simply how science gets its funding in the world that we live in. But what had happened was, after the Vietnam War, the problems with getting people to join the military were so immense because they had to do away with the draft that they basically said, we've got to find some new way of enculturating the people who come into the military, so it's like a cult, and they're unable to acclimate to an outside environment and have to keep coming back. So what the U.S. military did was, again, they went to Aquino, who had specialized in psychological warfare operations. He became an enormous influence on the U.S. military. The very fact that he was recognized as the official satanic chaplain and wrote the chaplain's handbook has to tell you how influential this man was. And he basically, in those days, by the way, he used to tell me about that someday he would get back at the CIA. The Army was extremely angry at the CIA because of the fact that the CIA had resources they were unwilling to share with the Army after the Army had helped to get them established back in 1947 after the Roswell incident. So he used to tell me about how they were someday going to take over the CIA, and with the U.S. Army's institution of General Petraeus as an Army officer commanding the CIA, it looks like the Army won out in that interdepartmental infighting. Okay. But you know, he used to tell me things like, you know, Douglas, he used to say to me about things that were applied to social control. He'd say, Physics, chemistry, and biology are close to having gone as far as they can go on their own. We've mapped the human genome. We can incinerate large cities in a single atomic flash. We took religion out of the schools and we substituted Ritalin. We have spy satellites that can read a newspaper from space. And he would say things like, to go further, we require the paranormal, the mystic, the occult, to provide the fulcrum for our efforts. And he used to say it'd be the extra and crucial factor, the dimension in which the true control of the masses would really begin to become effective. And he used to tell me, you have to look at it this way, Doug. Physics has given us the capability to deliver a nuclear fission weapon by means of an intercontinental ballistic missile. But Islamic mysticism has given us individuals so devoted to the worship of Allah that they'll deliver a nuclear fusion weapon in suitcases on commercial airliners. By the way, he was telling me stuff like this well before 9/11. And he said, for the price of a ticket and some primitive ingenuity, the entire strategic missile defense shield is rendered redundant. And again, he would always emphasize, if nothing else, the paranormal is cost effective. Of course, I would say something back like, well, it's not about cost effectiveness, is it, Colonel? You've got billions of dollars to work with. Trillions. And he says, yeah, of course not. It's about power from a long hidden direction. He used to tell me, what we're dealing with is an entire branch of science we know close to nothing about. Imagine the crew of an airborne stealth system who were also members of an interlinked telepathic coven. He'd say, we've barely scratched the surface. We're playing with elementary toys, implants, psyops, non-technological biofeedback, trance states, psychedelics, remote viewing, precog, telekinesis, all that stuff from Sid Gottlieb on. It's all kindergarten level, Douglas. He'd tell me, it's the equivalent of Lego. And while we play with Lego, there's 1,000 years of unexamined data locked up in the Vatican Library. And he'd say, you'd take a tactical nuke to pry it out, those quasi-celibate mother effers. He'd go on and rave about that for a while. But definitely, this was his mentality, and he was employed by the U.S. Army, or ordered, to develop something that would help keep people into the military in a cultic bond. So he employed various human potential movement think tanks, and he organized Task Force Delta. Task Force Delta is not to be confused with Delta Force, which is a commando unit that was so disastrously misapplied during Carter's attempt to rescue the hostages in Iran. Task Force Delta was an Army think tank of officers, futurists, psychologists. It was all formed to study the potential of new technologies to solve the Army's personnel problems. So he got this jackass named Lieutenant Colonel James Channon. And James Channon was a really weird dude. He was basically what I considered to be a high-grade moron. He was a graduate of West Point, and he had flunked his English exams and pretty much been basically, let me see if I remember this correctly. He didn't graduate from West Point. His dad did, because he was always talking about that. But he couldn't enter West Point because he flunked his English exam. And then he just got into being an officer through the regular, he had graduated from a school, so he was a lieutenant. He was pretty much the only surviving platoon leader in his battalion. After about 5 months of service in Vietnam, he was the only platoon leader in the battalion left alive, and he was probably almost killed at least 3 times in one day. And he had this religious experience which attracted him to Aquino, because while Aquino was in country, he heard Aquino saying, in an environment like this, we can't call on God, we've got to call on Satan. And it appealed to him, and he became involved with the Temple of Sept. And so through Channon, who became Aquino's battering ram, Aquino was able to establish the 1st Earth Battalion of Satanists, and Lieutenant Colonel James Channon could do things that Aquino could never do. Because since Aquino was recognized as the U.S. Army's official satanic chaplain, Aquino could go on Oprah Winfrey, he could go on Geraldo Rivera, he could go on all these TV talk shows dressed in his Temple of Set uniform, but he was not allowed to wear a U.S. Army uniform, because the U.S. Army still wanted plausible deniability. But on the other hand, Lieutenant Colonel James Channon could go everywhere in uniform and basically represent the church without people knowing he was connected to it. And it's because of Lieutenant Colonel James Channon, that's one of the reasons why we couldn't prosecute any of the satanic crime in the United States. I'll give you an example. the woman who arrested my instructor Gary Hambright from high school, who managed the daycare center, name was Sandy Gallant. Last name Gallant. People can look this up. First name Sandy, I believe it was Sandi. Sandy Gallant was known all over the United States as an occult investigator for the San Francisco Police Department. Back in the 1980s, they found a headless body in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and in place of the head, the human head, was a chicken head. And she said, "This is Santeria. This is an occult ritual from Voodoo." She said someone will try to reunite that head with the body within a matter of about 42 days. She gave some matter of days in which it would be, somebody would try to do that. It was 24 days or something like that. Mm-hmm. And she said they are going to try to create a zombie. And everybody laughed at her. Well, the exact time that she predicted it, it occurred. Somebody broke into the morgue and tried to reunite the head with the body using stitches. The security guard at the morgue got into an enormous fight with them. It was violent. The other person ran off with the head. They never caught him. But because she was so accurate, she became known as an expert in occult crime. Now, because of that, she was pursuing Aquino and various other people on charges of satanic crime, crimes pursued in the name of a religious belief. Well, Lieutenant Colonel James Channon went to all of the FBI and federal police departments, ATF, local police constabularies like LAPD, San Francisco Police Department. He said to all of these people, hey, if a Catholic criminal robbed a bank and dropped a Catholic religious medal on site of the bank scene, would that implicate the Catholic Church? They said no. They said, well, if you went to a serial killer's home and you found a portrait of Madonna Negro, the Black Madonna, up there on the wall, would that implicate the Polish community, which is Catholic and has that as a saint, a saintly icon? No. And so he said, well, you can't implicate the Satanic Church or movement for any pentagrams or any of these occult symbols found at a crime scene. So they said, great, that means less work for us. So all of this occult criminal evidence that was in all of these field manuals for investigation for the FBI, ATF, and local constabularies, police departments, all went out the window. They just excised it from all their books, and you never heard about Sandy Gallant again.
As far as I know, there's one man who followed up on this. I think he's ex-FBI. Or was it CIA? Ted Gunderson, right? He did some work on this, too. Yeah,
but he was doing that in his retirement.
That's true, yeah. He did this afterwards. He was assigned one of the cases, wasn't he? During he was active for a while, and he looked into one of the cases.
Well, interestingly enough, if I remember correctly, he was retired when he came on site the Presidio military base, and he pretty much came there well after it was over. Mm-hmm. He might have been looking around or poking around during that time, but I never personally saw him, and I was there, and I was working with the FBI, who was there, because that was one of the problems, was the FBI, ATF, Criminal Investigations Division of the U.S. Army. All of these people were involved, and they had all these jurisdictional problems. That's why nothing was getting done. And if I hadn't done what I did concerning the child pornography within a school building, nothing would have gotten done. And thanks to men like Lieutenant Colonel James Channon, nothing ever will get done. Because now they find bodies in the middle of pentagrams, and they just dismiss that evidence.
Okay.
And so what else was it that they did was they got together the DeltaNet, and DeltaNet was basically the Army computer network. And the official designator of the U.S. Army Delta Force Computer Conference and the Electronic Mail Network had over 1,000 members, and they referred to themselves as the tribe, quote-unquote the tribe. That child-raping SOB, that U.S. Army Ranger, was an upstanding member of that tribe. And that was, you've got to perk your ears up if you ever hear anyone use that term. I don't know if anyone uses it anymore. But they used it as a kind of reference to the lost 13th tribe of Israel, but they always referred to themselves as the tribe. And that was basically a huge child pornography ring within the U.S. Army. And when you take a look at the members who were basically supporting the 1st Earth Battalion, you're talking about people who they actually filmed their charter initiation. It was conducted at the second quarterly meeting of Task Force Delta. They sat around a table at the U.S. Army War College Officer Club at Fort Leavenworth, and they lit a bunch of candles, did the satanic ceremony, and basically were organizing this kind of satanic monastery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which Colonel Aquino took me to visit. And the reason they did that was because they incorporated it. The 1st Earth Battalion became wholly private and non-profit, and yet this way the U.S. Army could have plausible deniability, yet they still got government funding. See, this is the kind of craziness that we're talking about. But their materials, think about what I'm saying. They're private, they're non-funded, but their training materials were used by more than 800 officers in their network at the time that I was working there.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they had this 20-minute videotape. Back in those days, we had videotapes as opposed to DVDs or flash drives. And the Command and Staff College included, officially, as well as West Point, they both officially included the 1st Earth Battalion in their human relations curricula. And the people who were doing this, basically, were high-ranking generals. And I took the trouble to remember their names. The people who were supporting the 1st Earth Battalion, they were 2 4-star generals. I think it was Robert Shoemaker, Glenn K. Otis. They belonged to the Delta Network. And there were 6 major generals: Sam Wetzel, Dale Besser, Bob Moore, Jack Merritt, James Ellis, Bob Elton. There were 3 brigadier generals: Alan Omo, Hardin Olson, Rick Brown, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Equal Opportunity and Safety, Dr. Sharon Lord. These were all members of that DeltaNet, and they all supported the 1st Earth Battalion and getting its curricula as basically mandatory in terms of U.S. officer military training. And basically what they were ultimately consulted for, one of the things that General Shoemaker was claiming, and he was that 4-star general I was talking about, he assumed ultimately the post of Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, and he organized a Task Force Delta Conference to draw up organizational planning for training leaders. And what did they use? 1st Earth Battalion materials. So this is the kind of influence that these people had, and yet they were supposedly a private monastery. So basically, when I was down there at the insane asylum, that was their monastery, they were bringing back all the rituals of warfare from the Indians. You know, feathers, war paint, chants, dances, tom-tom drums. And I was like, you know, asking them, first off, why are you bringing me here? And James Channon, the high-grade moron, told me, well, it's all rainbow power, Douglas. He was saying each race has all these attributes. You know, blacks offer soul. The brown people, the Latin Americans, offer heart. The red people, the American Indians, they offer grace. The whites, the European descended Americans, they offer vision. And yellow people, the Asians, they offer balance. I said, well, you know, my father was Caucasian and my mother was Asian. What do you want from me? And Colonel Aquino behind me says, well, I was hoping you would donate some brains. This is the kind of attitude that Aquino had towards these people. He didn't even respect him. And because they were all just pawns to be manipulated to him. Mm-hmm. But the end result was that with this chanting and dancing and all this Indian stuff going on, I was asking him, what is this all about? And he said, well, you know, we effectively exterminated the American Indians. We stole their land. We stole everything from them. We've got nothing left to steal now but their culture. And I thought that pretty much said it all. They just won't stop taking it until they take it all.
The Man Who Stared Goats was the book written about this. There was even a feature movie about this later on as well. And this is about the Earth First Battalion. And usually we hear that these are programs running, I don't know, back from the 50s maybe up to the 80s or something like that. What do you know about the continuation of these types of programs and how much of this is carried on? Because First Earth Battalion, they were into developing psychic soldiers and all this, as you explained, of trying to walk through walls and everything else and basically stopping the heart of goats, right? That was one of the training things they had. And eventually, if this was successful, they had ideas of transferring this over to humans, basically. But how far do you think they actually got in success? The documentary that's made about this and the book that's written kind of details this as a failure, basically, that this was all bunk. These are crazy people who are trying to achieve things that they never actually managed to do. In your opinion, did they manage to accomplish something? Has their work continued in any way, as far as you know, Douglas?
In terms of what they accomplished, that's both a yes and a no. Yes, they are a bunch of crazy people who waste an enormous amount of money. It's not their money. They don't care. And they waste it in the millions and millions of dollars. And a lot of it is pork barrel, as they say, scamming. A lot of it is a scam. Basically, what Colonel Aquino was doing in a very real sense was setting up a welfare state for sorcerers, just as the CIA, through its remote viewing program, was setting up a permanent employment program for psychics. But the reality is, when you get to the serious people, like Colonel Aquino and the members of his coven, when he was, when the Presidio daycare scandal went down during that period of 2 years, where was he? He was in Washington, D.C. and in Virginia. And what happened? Well, the sheriffs in that region were investigating him, and they found out that he had a whole coven full of intelligence officers that were serving with him as sorcerers, and who were involved in various occult rituals. And this is nothing that's hidden. I mean, people can look this up about what was going on in Virginia because the sheriffs were investigating him there. And that is kind of just, again, indicative that this is open, that this was something that was not simply some kind of fraternity boy prank. These men were taking it seriously. When we're talking about men in those circles, then you're talking about things that happen. Then you're getting results. Magic is very much, I've seen it work. I speak of this heavily in my DVD, Satan's Crusaders. Again, check DouglasDietrich.com for that. But the point is that the rituals that I saw, to give you an example, I was personally witness to the efficaciousness of these various rituals in their own way. As a matter of fact, one of these rituals gone terribly wrong was one of the reasons why he could no longer consider me as a potential heir to his position, because I essentially was, as far as can be discerned, possessed for a very short period of time, which rendered me useless for being a magician along the lines of what he was thinking. Essentially, at that point, you're tainted. So because of that, that was done with a ritual that was gone wrong, without the proper protection in terms of its ceremony. We have to remember that consider magic spells to be kind of like program cheat codes for a video game. You're feeding in different instructions to the reality matrix around you. And what you're doing is you're basically altering that reality through your own efforts and through basically resonating on a quantum level with altering the space-time continuum in which you're currently residing. A good example would be retroactive PK. He did a lot of work with Duke of, J.B. Rhine of Duke University, and he was still active at the time. And retroactive PK was one of the most cross-confirmed phenomena that's out there in science. And in those days, we had audio cassettes. He would record a certain number of beeps and squeaks and sounds on audio cassettes, put them in a safe. And as a librarian, I had to guard and monitor that safe. He would have men come in and concentrate on altering the recordings that were made on that audio cassette. We took that same cassette out, put it in the tape later on, and a whole different series of sounds would be on it. Now, that's retroactive PK. Mm-hmm. So they were able to alter the contents of what's on that tape. They were able to cross-confirm this with what Ryan was doing at Duke University, and as a result, they were affecting the world around them, no doubt about it. And what I personally saw in terms of effects, again, I bring this up in that DVD. It's painful for me to go into, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. I would work at night. Basically, I would work 18 hours a day. I was looking forward to a career with the Department of Defense. I worked a day shift. I worked a night shift. We needed the money for my family. I needed the overtime. I grew up in a ghetto. So I would spend only a few hours a day at school, and the majority of my life I've never slept. That's the whole problem with the kind of existence that I led. That's what happens when you grow up in poverty and try to make it anywhere in the United States. People don't understand. Whatever you do, I can't understand why people come here. It's almost impossible to live here. But then again, I live in San Francisco, which is one of the most expensive places to live in on Earth. But the homelessness problem here is astronomical for a reason, especially in San Francisco. But in terms of my lifestyle then, I was working 18 hours a day quite often. at least 16. And when I was working at night on the incinerator, they would burn all the documents at night, rather I would, because it made the library extremely hot and uncomfortable for the clients. So we wouldn't do it in the daytime. So I'm burning all the documents late at night, and they were conducting one ritual in which they had a wax hand. Again, I have a photo of it in the DVD. I took all these black and white photos because I had a miniature camera, the kind you used to see in the 1950s and 1960s, James Bond films, where they had the little German cameras that they used to make that you used to click them open like a cigarette case, and you used to be able to buy film for them that you kept refrigerated, etc. I learned all this in criminology class. But they had a wax hand to represent the hand that had offended them. And they got together, Aquino and his coven of 12 other officers, and they concentrated on killing this person in his sleep. And they made a call unto the angel of death to manifest. And I'll be damned if I wasn't in that room and the entire room went black. Keep in mind, I've got a full-blown incinerator going. This is a multi-million-dollar incinerator, like the kind they have at Langley, Virginia, the CIA headquarters. And it went dark. It wasn't providing any light. People say to me, "Oh, yeah, you mean the lights flickered out?" I said, "No, I mean the room went black. Something entered that library facility that either absorbed, deflected, or prevented any ambient light from getting into that facility." Mm-hmm. And I was wandering at the time out because the chanting had become so intense. I knew exactly where they were positioned. And they hadn't switched sides because it was impossible. See, when they're in a physical circle like that, you can't move. You can't move because it endangers you. Once you get into gnosis and you're calling on an entity, there is evocation and there is invocation. And there is the summoning of the entity, then there is the gnosis, or intimate communion with the entity. You break that by movement or diversion of attention, and you risk the danger of becoming invaded, of the entity breaking loose from your control. So they were not changing position, and I swear, all of the other 12 men spoke with Aquino's voice, and he spoke with the voice of 12 other men. In other words, it was like they had all switched voices. All those other 12 men were speaking with the voice of a single man, Aquino. He was chanting with the voice of 12 men. It was a very disturbing audio phenomena in which at that time impacted me in that pitch blackness. And later on I understood that they were very satisfied with the results. The man they were targeting had died in his sleep. And this was conducted at the School of the Americas, is where they often taught this ritual.
Do you know who the target was? I
do not know who the target was. No. I took a photograph of the wax hand later, mm-hmm. and I was lucky to get away with what I did quite often. Obviously, he liked me, and I'm sure he was, I wouldn't say he was aware of what I was doing with the photographs and whatnot, but he probably would have let me get away with it anyway. And as I say, it wasn't so much a personal animosity that we broke off with. It was later on when one of these rituals went terribly awry, and an entity got into, not just myself, but everybody involved in the ritual, because he wasn't there to act as adult supervision, and I wasn't participating. I was collateral damage. Then basically at that point, I couldn't be the kind of magician that he was intending.
So was that why you decided to eventually speak out about Aquino and all these activities? I mean, if you worked for him with a long time, or for him, what made you change your mind here, or why did you switch on this?
Well, I hope I'm not giving you the impression that this was something that I ever entered voluntarily. What I wanted was just a career with the Department of Defense, something that I could easily work as a librarian without doing all this work, get to the level of government responsibility where you're entirely irresponsible. I wanted the kind of position all my superiors had, where I could sit down and do nothing but give orders to others. So that's all I was looking for. Mm-hmm. In the course of that, I was assigned liaison responsibilities to the U.S. Army's officially recognized satanic chaplain, and perforce was forced to accompany him on various jaunts that he had to go on where he felt he needed me as a liaison, and other than that, I was ordering grimoires for him through the library, occult tomes, texts, rituals, etc.
Yeah.
And other than that, I was witness to what he was conducting on site in terms of ritualism with some of the men, of which there were many, in the high command who were involved with his activities. So it's not something where, oh, I was intrigued by this and entered it with the hopes of becoming a heir apparent. I hope that that's clear.
Okay, yeah. You've detailed that for me now. And so tell us about or why you decided then eventually to speak out against this. I mean, obviously you must have quit and you realized, okay, this is some atrocities, and was it basically I have to detail this to the rest of the world out there, or what was your basis for this?
Oh, it was a combination of factors. Obviously, by 1995, when I was anonymously donating the Roswell shrapnel that I had absconded with, and I was stealing many materials throughout the time I was working with the Department of Defense, and I'm proud to say it. There are times when theft is indeed a virtue, and in the case of what was going on with the Department of Defense, I was working with so many things under protest. I was taking copious notes. I would trace over blueprints using the paper that they weren't tracking, which was private corporation paper that belonged to RAND think tanks or MIT think tanks, various think tanks that contracted with the government. Since it was private materials or a private corporation, they weren't monitoring their materials, so I would steal their paper and trace documents on, etc., or blueprints. So there were many things I knew how to work with. Had I been a foreign intelligence agent, I could have done enormous damage. But that's the level of incompetence and corruption that we're talking about. And as it was, I was keeping it all to myself because I was becoming extremely resentful even then. And when I entered the Marine Corps, it wasn't with any naive desire to serve the United States as a constitutional republic. It was simply to get training so that I could serve on contract as a private mercenary and make enough money to pull my family out of poverty. So I had been rendered very cynical from an early age of working with all of these perverts and child molesters who predominated, unfortunately, within the U.S. military. And that's often why they're overseas. I mean, they can commit crimes overseas that they will never be prosecuted for against children. Quite a few of them. And unfortunately, that happens again and again. They had to get the U.S. Navy to stop porting and berthing in Thailand because so many of the sailors and officers were coming back with AIDS.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of intensity that we're talking about in terms of debauchery. So it's not some kind of prudish, reactionary, conservative religious stance, far from it, that leads me to this. It's just that I grew up in, and I say the word grew up quite pointedly, I came of age. I reached puberty working around these people. And you begin to realize, my God, when I realized when I was 25 years old that it wasn't me, it was them, that was somehow twisted in terms of sexual orientation, that was somehow warped, somehow evil, malevolent, I felt so dirty, so abused, so violated. And I've felt that way ever since. I can't begin to imagine how these super soldiers feel who have grown up being raped, being pimped out, being physically abused. I can't imagine what they go through.
Yeah.
And it's for reasons like that that I've come forth because, and also, there's nothing left for me to do. I've lost everything. When I did private security and mercenary contracts, profits directly proportionate to risk. I took high risks. I made a lot of money. I made enough money to buy either a really small home or a really big car. And in San Francisco, that's saying a lot. And when I came home, I had to spend it all on my parents, on their medical expenses, because their health took a turn for the worse, and the U.S. military, the U.S. government, let them down. All the military bases in the area closed. I had to get my father into the VA system. VA system is civilian. It's not military. You become like a welfare recipient. They wouldn't let his wife in. Unless the spouse is treated at the VA before the age of 65, she can't get in. So I had nowhere to take her. I had to get her on private insurance. And then I had to get her on Medicare, Medi-Cal, because I used up all my money for the private insurance. Then I had to get him on the Medicare, Medi-Cal, because she couldn't get on it unless she divorced him because he used the husband's Social Security number for the Medi-Cal in the United States. They wouldn't divorce. So I had to get him on there as well. And in order to do that, I had to enter a lawsuit with the state of California only because of my research background as a DoD librarian was I even capable of representing them to the point where it got, where they ultimately gave up fighting, and it was the city of San Francisco that put them on, so long as I paid $2,000 a month, $1,000 a month for each parent, every month that they were alive. And I paid that until they died, as well as many other expenses that weren't covered by Medi-Cal. There's many medicines not on their formulary, etc. I went broke. I spent everything that I had earned, well over $250,000, probably $750,000. I did after several years. I stopped counting. I blew all my money on that. And the U.S. government, what good was it? My dad served in 3 wars. It was meaningless. It was meaningless.
Well, now you get the idea of what Kissinger talked about when he mentioned that military men are just stupid fodder, right? Wasn't that what he said? And
they're stupid animals to be used as pawns.
Something like that, yeah.
And that is pretty much what it was about. And I was cynical enough before then. At this point, I'm beyond cynical. I realize that the United States government and everything it represents is pure, raw evil. And there is no other way of putting it. I realized it when I was working with them, but I had a higher tolerance level because I grew up surrounded by these people. Now that I'm out of that environment, I shudder to look at them. So it is definitely, and this is why it's so important for me to get the real history out. We can dedicate another program at some time, either to the Roswell incident or to the hidden history of the Second World War. By the way, that's covered in the Nexus magazine. Anybody who wants to get a good hint of what I speak of when it comes to UFO phenomena affiliated with the Third Reich in exile, based on the documents I was contending with, the intelligence Kino was involved with, etc. I need to emphasize the fact that Nexus Magazine is covering it in those articles, and hopefully we'll speak of it here. Which brings us to the point. I don't know how much time we have left.
Yeah, we should begin running up in a little bit here, Douglas. But I do want to give you an opportunity to mention your books as well that you have upcoming, because we forgot about that in the first hour, and they've been slightly delayed, I guess. But how's that progressing for you then?
No, thank you very much for asking about that. The problem with the book, what was the title even? The Reality of the Red Undead, The Untold True Story of the Supernatural Soviets, was based on documents that had been stolen from the Soviet Union by the Central Intelligence Agency or the Defense Intelligence Agency, distributed amongst NATO High Command, many of which were considered to be disinformation. And ultimately rejected and dismissed, declassified, slated for destruction. I took down copious notes. Ultimately, I'm putting them together in the book. Others are based on absolute reality, dealing with the horrors of just the use of people who have been altered pharmacologically as weapons of mass destruction. And the term zombies and vampires is a very real term, and it applies to very real conditions. So I definitely want to make this known. The problem is that the publishers that we were trying to make deals with wanted me to put the zombies and the vampires together in a single book. Then, of course, there's the argument, since we're talking about the Soviets, whether to include what was done in the United States. So we had to argue as to whether or not that be represented, because that's a totally different phenomena. So that's what's caused these multiple delays. And then the incident with the bath salts directly impinges on what I was talking about with zombie pharmacosis. So that was talking about many of the voodoo rituals that we were referencing in the book itself. Then we had to, we're still working on it, but it should be out by the first week of November or very much around there, would be that one book, and also Roswell and the Rising Sun. We've transcribed it, so we're trying to turn that into a book as well, and that will all ultimately be what my reputation has to rest on, is those two books. They'll probably come out at the same time. So all the negotiations involved with that, the transcription, etc., these are obviously, they're not easy, especially considering all of the other responsibilities I had to contend with. I'm not a good writer. All of my writing was done in the format that I was indoctrinated in with the Department of Defense. And so my writing style is practically illegible. And I had to basically put it through multiple editors to literally make it accessible to the public, because the kind of format and linguistics that I use, the nomenclature, it's just inaccessible to them. So that was a major problem in writing, and I hope that puts it in some perspective, but I thank you for bringing that up, most certainly. So there's that, and do you want me to kind of outline a bit about some of that zombie or vampire phenomena or the Roswell phenomena? It's up to you. If we don't have that much time left, we can go over some final things concerning Satanism in the military, unless you feel that we've covered that quite adequately.
We have covered it quite a bit, I think. I think what we should do, Douglas, is we should leave people with the story for now. You talk fast and you have a lot of information in there, so I think this is a good way to let people simmer down a little bit and digest this and, of course, make up their mind what to make about all of this and put it into context of what they know and so forth as well. So I think we should leave the Roswell thing for a later time, since that's another subject altogether, as you said. And then at that point we can see if we want to talk more about the Soviets, undead, and the zombies and all that as well. But why don't we, for now then, give out your website again, Douglas, so people know where to go if they want to find out more, if they want to read more about you and your books and upcoming stuff, of course, and the DVDs that you have available there. DouglasDietrich.com. Go ahead, Douglas.
Yes, thank you very much for asking. Again, that's www.douglasdietrich.com. Douglas is spelled with one S. Dietrich is a famous Germanic name, and it's spelled just the way the actress Marlene Dietrich spelled it. And in America, they have a very difficult time with it. There shouldn't be too much of a problem in Europe, but I always tell Americans, put the words diet and rich together. So DouglasDietRich.com. And the DVDs that we're selling are, of course, extremely low on stock. After the convention was over, we pretty much exhausted the supply, and we're left with about half a hundred of them. So do jump on that while you have the chance. We are not going to be reissuing them again because of the book itself being transcripted and the hopes to ultimately probably undergo cinematic exposure with it at some point to counter military-industrial propaganda films like Independence Day and the Battle of Los Angeles. And as for the Satan's Crusaders DVD, I will be speaking to that again at the Super Soldier Summit, the second one being held at probably Las Vegas around March of 2013. And by that time, of course, we're going to have that supply totally depleted, and we want it to be depleted because when I speak to it at the next Super Soldier Summit #2, we're hoping to turn that into a DVD or and transcript it so we can get that probably into a book format at some point. Obviously, it's important to get these things in print, and towards that end, we're offering both DVDs for the price of one until they're all gone. Also, again, and I can't overemphasize this, the NexusMagazine.com, which I'm sure many Europeans are familiar with, and you can just unload the articles specifically in which I speak of the Third Reich in exile, and UFO phenomena that's affiliated with that, as well as the hidden history of the Second World War in the European context, for $1.50 each. And the other one's coming out in magazine format literally as we speak. I just finished talking to Ruth Parnell, who is the editor who helps Duncan Rhodes in Australia get that magazine out, and we're definitely going to see that hit the magazine stands and racks very, very soon. I mean, literally within days, if it's not out there already. So those are the two foremost things that come to mind, and there's no other speaking engagements that I have planned in that I can think of right now in the near future. But hopefully, at some point, it will be arranged by Exopolitics UK with David Griffin or something like that I speak out there in the European theater, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Duncan Rhodes is bringing me down to Australia in 2013 to speak. So at their next Nexus conference, they were unable to put one together this year, so we're going to be doing it in 2013. So altogether, obviously, I've got some international exposure, and one of the reasons why is because, as you can imagine, they're very, very much in denial in the United States in terms of what I have to say. And I face an enormous amount of hostility here, but fortunately also an enormous amount of support. Because one of the reasons that I get the support that I do is no one can deny what I'm saying. The reality is that much of what I speak of, the overwhelming amount of it, is documented. And people can look up on the Internet and find references to what I'm saying that are utterly undeniable. And beyond that, what is not documented, what has been destroyed, makes no sense outside of the context of the narrative that I place it in. when people say, gee, why does this happen? What goes on with this? I mean, a good example would be the dark side of Aldoura. And I believe Aldoura is spelled A-L-D-O-U-R-A, two separate words, A-L and then D-O-U-R-A. Dark side of Aldoura talks about a U.S. Army Ranger who was suffering from the legacy of satanic chaplaincy. I've placed this on my Facebook wall several times. It's never been taken down. I've been very fortunate that Facebook hasn't asked me to take it down because the scenes are very graphic and violent. And right at the beginning of that documentary, they show Dick Cheney saying, we have to go to the dark side. We have to go to the dark side. And then they show the terrible experience of this U.S. Army Ranger who ultimately went insane and ultimately died after he killed a few people back in the United States. And this individual was with a Ranger unit where they were conducting satanic sacrifices. I knew they were satanic sacrifices because I come from a background where I was well acquainted with the ritual. And they were going up to unarmed men and boys, always had to be male, cracking their skulls open either with a bullet at point blank range, hollow point, or other means, and they would take the brains out with gloves and then take a bite of the brain, which kind of made the gloves redundant, but nonetheless is part of a satanic communion ritual. So he was witness to this, and he couldn't understand it happening again and again, and he kept reporting it as a war crime, and his superiors kept telling him to shut up, suck it up, join with the program. Finally, he wouldn't take any more. They locked him up in a containment box, beat him to the point of madness. Finally, his father got him sent home, and where, of course, he killed his girlfriend. And then they let him go because he was a veteran, not in control of his own actions. And while he was taking a walk with his father along the beach, he just died, just dropped dead right in front of him. And it reminds me of those rituals that were conducted to kill people from a distance. Other people who were into the technological explanation might say he was beamed. Certainly my mother, when she died, it was fairly inexplicable. The doctors had never seen anything like it. When I came home after filming the Roswell and the Rising Sun DVD, I had agreed to talk with Cynthia Siegel, who is the director of the Sacramento MUFON. Sacramento is the capital of the state of California in the United States, and MUFON is the Mutual UFO Network. So the director of MUFON in Sacramento, the capital of California, Cynthia Siegel, used to run a television show called the UFO Connection for years. And she invited me to speak about Roswell on a television program. The moment they found out I was going to be her guest, they canceled the entire program. I mean, literally took the entire program off the air. Not like canceled one episode. I mean, literally took her off the air. So her entire program was canceled off the air forever, permanently. So she knew what I was talking about was important, so we got together in a private venue, literally just a restaurant, a franchise restaurant. We rented out the speaker space in, had the highest attendance that the Sacramento branch of Mutual UFO Network ever had. And we didn't even advertise. And we only let people know we were going to be talking about this 1 week beforehand. The word spread like wildfire. Mostly Korean War veterans were there. Because the Second World War in the Pacific directly impacted and led into the Korean War. They're basically the same war. And what had happened was that I came home after that. We didn't even have a movie screen, but you still see the images pretty clearly when you see them on the DVD. But that's how desperate we were to get this out right away, and how sub rosa we were working, how frightened she was. Then I came home, and my mother was on the floor on top of 2 shattered portraits, and I brought her to the emergency room. She has care providers. I had care providers I'd employed for years. They couldn't make it there because they'd all been detained by men in suits with dark limousines and dark glasses. And I've worked with these people for years. They would never lie about this. They'd been helping me take care of my mother for years. That's one of the reasons I went broke. I was paying $2,000 a month to these people, tax-free. So they would help 24 hours a day, and they'd worked very loyally and very competently for a decade with me. There's no way they would lie about that. They'd been detained by essentially government men. And when I came home and found my mother on the floor, I called the ambulance. We brought her there. Doctors had never seen anything like it. They said there's no bruises, there's no contusions, there's no marks on her. But her aorta, the main vein leading to her heart, is dissected. Not ruptured. Not ruptured. Dissected. They said it was like a laser scalpel went through it in 2 areas. They said she's going to die any second. She was in terrible agony because the blood kept seeping out of those dissections into the rest of her body, causing excruciating pain. She was like that until finally it stabilized miraculously. She lived another few months, but we couldn't get her rehabilitated enough to the point where they were willing to put a stent inside of her heart to prevent that from bursting open, and one day it did burst open, and she died. So, and that was under very mysterious circumstances. That was, all the while that when I released Roswell and the Rising Sun, when I made that DVD, at that one presentation I did at the franchise, Annie Jacobson was just completing her book after 5 years of research, Area 51. She was just about to send it to publication. It was supposed to come out on March 15th. And March 17th of that year, 2011. And she was approached by feds who offered her an enormous amount of money if she stuck in extra 7 pages concerning Roswell. This was right after I gave my presentation, which was in January of 2011. When I gave my presentation in January 2011, she was approached. She said, well, she went for it, and she stuck in that extra 7 pages about Roswell, and it totally destroyed her career. Because the rest of the book, Area 51, you can read it. It's fully footnoted. It's fully referenced. It's fully in context. Everybody she used was a prime source that was impeccable. And suddenly, for the money, she sticks in this extra 7 pages from a untrustworthy source that's totally incompetent, totally irreputable. And she destroyed her career as a result of 7 pages of disinformation that didn't make any sense. And it came out on the day my mother died. And when my mother died, I was called by the rest home I had put her in, because I had to stick her in a rest home at that point to rehabilitate her, trying to get her into the shape where she could take a stent insertion. And I was called and they said, your mother's dead. And I went over there. I couldn't even get in the building. It was the biggest storm San Francisco had suffered in its recorded history, the biggest rainstorm we'd ever had. They didn't even know I was downstairs. I spent hours pounding outside. There was nobody downstairs to let me in. All the hospitals are like this. All the rest homes are like this. Totally incompetent, totally corrupt. They're all like that, all over the United States. People don't know how bad it is here. Finally, we were able to get somebody to call them because I didn't have a cell phone. I stopped some people on the street to call them to let them know I was downstairs, because there was nobody out there in that rain, and cars wouldn't stop for me or nothing. Finally, there was somebody who was exiting their home, and they called in, let them know I was downstairs, and let me in. I went upstairs. Her window was wide open. In other words, it was the worst storm in San Francisco history. It's raining enormous amounts of rain. She was saturated, soaking wet, and she had died of pneumonia. So that happened on the day of the release of Annie Jacobson's book, Area 51. There's no way any of this is coincidence. And all of this is part of that level of government terrorism and occult ritual at which they work. And that's the kind of scumbags we're talking about. And the only reason I'm alive and can say what I do with impunity is because during all my time with Colonel Aquino, the time that I was working with him, that would take an entire different story to explain about how this works. When I talked about Lieutenant Colonel James Channon and everything he had access to, it ultimately went into the high-tech world because Lieutenant James Channon was put in charge of an enormous amount of budgets for the 1st Earth Battalion. They actually created what they called a motorcade of New Age armor. Honda motorcycles with lasers on the handlebars. And we're just talking about like laser pointer type crap, not real lasers, but mortars on the rear fenders. Dune buggies with Gatling guns on the roll bars. This is the kind of discretionary income this guy had to play with out there in the desert, so that it gives you an idea of the kind of budget that they had. And he was put in charge of, ultimately, some technological exchange programs concerning the high-tech areas in the Northwest, where they were developing experimental weapons. And he was there to, believe it or not, bless the weapons with satanic blessings. I mean, this is the level of insanity we're talking about in terms of the kind of assets that these people have, the kind of budgets that they have. And when I bring this up in the DVD, Satan's Crusaders, where I show the weapons he was involved with up there in the Northwest, and the kind of high-tech low Earth orbital satellites that look like just passing overhead stars that served as relay units for the resonance that was being projected from the HARP program. So I bring a lot of that up. And so this is the level of technology we ultimately get involved with. And a lot of people don't understand that the military doesn't think of these as purely technological weapons. To them, these are all part of harnessing occult science. And so all the while I was liaising with Colonel Aquino, and he was considering me his heir apparent, things slipped. I handled his correspondence. I wound up with things that I was never supposed to see, as always. And so I had ultimately access to the occult equivalent of the nuclear codes. So I put them on a post-mortem release on Facebook, amongst other venues for release if I were to die. That's why I have an executrix as opposed to a manager. An executrix is a woman who's in charge of your estate. So if I'm taken out, amongst the other things that happen is the post-mortem activation of the Facebook, which downloads that onto Facebook. Now, Facebook is totally government monitored. And by putting it on Facebook, they were able to see what it was that I had and confirm that I had what I claimed I had. So there's other media venues which it will be released by, aside from that Facebook post-mortem release. Now,
all right,
I need
Douglas,
to emphasize
we'll leave it at that for this time. We need to begin to wrap things up for this time.
I don't want to
cut you off there,
people.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that whether or not you believe in magic. It doesn't matter whether or not you accept as a rationalist or a materialist what I'm saying. What matters is that they believe it. It doesn't matter that I don't believe it, even if it were the occult equivalent of the nuclear codes. That it doesn't matter whether I believe it or not. What matters is they believe it.
Sure, they act accordingly. And yeah, definitely. DouglasDietrich.com, that's the website. Douglas, we need to begin rounding things up for this time then. So thank you for being generous with your time and, of course, your perspective today. Douglas, stay well, be well, and I hope we can talk more at a later point.
Yes, I look forward to it, and thank you very much for your patience, and thank you to your audience for sharing this time with me, and apologize if I get a little personal with it, but I think the personal motivations of any whistleblower are more important to the public that receives this news than anything.
All right, there you have it.